What if the stories of devastating floods and lost civilizations are more than mere myths? In this captivating exploration, we delve into the ancient narratives of the Great Flood, from the fabled sinking of Atlantis to the heroic journeys of Noah and Xisuthros. Discover the shared themes of redemption, resilience, and the moral lessons embedded in these tales as we uncover how cultures across the globe have grappled with the consequences of humanity's hubris. Join us on a thrilling journey through time and space to reveal how these timeless stories continue to shape our understanding of existence and our place in the universe. The Deluge. The destruction of Atlantis described in the Deluge legends. The temple stood resolute atop the cliffs, a monolithic testament to the glory of Atlantis. But now it quaked beneath the fury of the storm. The vast expanse of the Atlantic raged below, its waters clawing at the shores as if to reclaim the land itself. Lightning tore across the heavens, illuminating the marble spires and the faces of the desperate gathered within the temple's grand hall. The high priest, a man whose years were etched in the deep furrows of his brow, stood before an altar of gold and stone. His voice rose above the tremors and the cries of the people outside. "This is no ordinary storm," he declared. His words weighted with foreknowledge. "The gods have spoken through the earth and the sea. We ignored the signs, and now the wrath of the heavens falls upon us." From the shadows, a young priest stepped forward, his robe streaked with the mud of the streets. "High priest, is there nothing we can do? The floodwaters rise, the earth splits beneath us. Surely we can appease the gods. Sacrifice perhaps, or prayers of atonement." The elder's eyes were filled with sorrow. "It is too late. The destruction of Atlantis is upon us. This is no simple judgment, but the end of an age. We are witnessing the fulfillment of the prophecy told by the sages of old." The young priest's voice faltered. "But this island, this continent, is the cradle of civilization. How can it be erased so completely?" The high priest gestured toward the shaking earth beneath their feet. "Such a calamity leaves scars not only upon the land, but upon the hearts of men. Its memory will echo through the ages, carried by our descendants to the farthest corners of the earth." In Athens, centuries later, the philosopher Solon recounted the story as it had been told to him by the priests of Sais in Egypt. "Before the great deluge of all," the Egyptian priest had said, "Athens stood as a beacon of resistance against the might of Atlantis. Your ancestors performed noble deeds, repelling their armies when they sought to subjugate the world. But their hubris could not be contained. The gods in their anger struck Atlantis down. The island sank, and with it, much of Athens' ancient glory was also swept away. Only fragments remain, preserved by memory and myth." The destruction of Atlantis was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern etched into the traditions of humankind. Across the world, echoes of this cataclysm could be found. Scholars of the ancient past later wrote of these connections. The story of the deluge is a universal tradition among all branches of the human race. Such a concordance of memory cannot be dismissed as mere myth. A catastrophe of this scale, one that destroyed a great civilization, must have left an indelible mark on the imagination of our ancestors. The biblical flood, the tale of Noah, was one such memory. This cataclysm must have occurred near humanity's earliest cradle before the great dispersal of the races. To suggest that local phenomena at disparate points on the globe produce identical legends is uncritical and improbable. The universality of the deluge myths points to a single, shared event. In the Americas, similar stories persisted. Among the Aryans, Semites, and Cushites, the three great branches of the civilized world, these traditions held firm. They spoke of a time when the earth was consumed by water, and only a chosen few were spared to rebuild humanity. Scholars like Cuvier, Quatrefages, and even Scobel debated the scope of the deluge. Could it have been universal, covering the entire globe, or was it localized, confined to the principal centers of early human civilization? Even Plato, whose account of Atlantis burned brightest in the minds of philosophers and dreamers, identified this cataclysm with the great deluge of all. The priest of Sais had said to Solon that after the destruction of Atlantis, a great convulsion engulfed not just the island but nearby lands as well, claiming countless lives. As the waters finally closed over the last spire of Atlantis, silence fell upon the sea. The island had vanished, swallowed whole by the forces of nature. In its place, the ocean stretched vast and unbroken, hiding the ruins beneath. But the memory remained, scattered like seeds upon the winds. The Africans told of Gikuyu and Mount Kenya. The Hebrews told of Noah and his ark. The Aryans sang of Manu, the sole survivor of a great flood. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who repopulated the earth. The peoples of the Americas whispered of their ancestors who had fled a sinking world. Each story bore the shadow of Atlantis, that ancient land whose pride had invited its fall, and though its marble towers and golden temples were lost to time, the story of its destruction would endure, carried forward by the descendants of those who had once called it home. The high priest's words proved prophetic. A calamity of this magnitude cannot fade into obscurity. It will become legend, a warning to all who come after. They will remember Atlantis not as it was in its glory, but as it fell, undone by its own hubris. And so the deluge became more than history. It became a lesson whispered across centuries and continents, a testament to the power of the earth and the fragility of mankind's greatest achievements. The deluge of the Bible, the world once vibrant with the hum of life, had become a breeding ground for violence and corruption, a place where the threads of decency frayed beneath the weight of wickedness. The cities that sprawled across the land were filled with oppression and deceit, the very air thick with malice. But there, amidst the chaos, stood Noah, a man set apart. His eyes, unwavering in their resolve, were lifted to the heavens, a quiet testament to the faith that had sustained him. For while the earth around him had become a cage of sin, he had walked with God, a righteous man in an age where such a thing seemed almost impossible. As the floodwaters gathered on the horizon, the divine decree had already been set in motion. The Lord's voice had thundered through the heavens, a declaration of judgment not just on humanity, but on the creatures that roamed the earth. The angels who had mingled with men, the sons of God, had borne children with the daughters of men, giants who walked the earth as mighty beings, their renown stretching across the lands. But their legacy was one of violence, as was the legacy of man himself. The thoughts of every heart had become evil, their intentions corrupt. In the ancient corners of the earth, the world before the flood was a place of great tumult. The civilization that inhabited it had expanded far beyond the simplicity of its origins. In those early days, men lived in harmony with the land. Adam, the first of mankind, had known no need for clothing. His body unadorned, his life simple and raw. But as humanity grew, so did its complexity. Adam's sons reflected this change. Abel tended flocks, while Cain built cities. Tubal-Cain worked with metal, and Jabal raised cattle. Each man, it seemed, found his way in the world, pushing humanity from the wild into the realms of culture and civilization. As the years passed, humanity's reach extended across the land, but with this growth came corruption. The world became a breeding ground for violence and depravity. Those who were once pure of heart began to twist their souls until the earth itself seemed to scream in its anguish. It was a time of great darkness where the line between the divine and the mortal blurred. According to the story, the sons of God mingled with the daughters of men, and from this union came the Nephilim, mighty beings of renown, but whose very existence was said to corrupt the world. These were no ordinary men. They were giants, both in size and in power, and their presence in the world only deepened its moral rot. The sky, it seemed, was filled with portentous signs. The earth was on the brink of an overwhelming crisis as mankind's wickedness reached a boiling point. It is said that even the Creator was moved to sorrow, his heart heavy with grief for his creation. It was then that the Lord decreed the destruction of all that had been made, save for a single man, Noah, who had found grace in the eyes of God. Noah, a righteous man, was chosen not only to save his family, but to preserve the seed of every living creature. The task set before him was monumental. He was commanded to build an ark, a massive vessel of wood, to carry his family and the creatures of the earth through the coming storm. The world was about to be washed clean by water, and Noah's ark would be the vessel of survival, both for man and beast alike. Two of every kind, both clean and unclean, were to come unto him, male and female, seeking refuge from the floodwaters that would soon engulf the land. It was a monumental feat, the construction of this ark. But Noah did not falter in his obedience. The ark took shape over many years, an immense structure that would carry the last vestiges of life in a world doomed to drown beneath the weight of its own sin. The flood, when it came, was not gentle. It was violent, a tempest that poured from both above and below, from the heavens and from the very depths of the earth. The waters rose steadily, swallowing everything in their path. Mountains were covered, cities drowned, and all life that did not seek refuge in the ark perished. This great deluge, however, was not an isolated event in human history. Similar stories of catastrophic floods appear across the ancient world. In cultures far removed from one another, the memory of a great flood persists. The Babylonians told of Gilgamesh, who sought immortality and found instead the tale of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. The ancient Greeks spoke of Deucalion, who built an ark to survive the wrath of Zeus. The Hindu traditions tell of Manu, who too was saved by a great flood, guided by a divine fish. In each of these stories, the flood serves as a means of divine retribution, a cleansing of the earth of the wickedness of men. While the biblical story focuses on Noah and his family, other ancient texts tell of civilizations that fell long before the waters came. Among these, the story of Atlantis stands out, its connection to the flood undeniable. The Atlanteans, much like those in the biblical tale, were a civilization of great power and prosperity. They too reached the height of their culture before their inevitable decline. Atlantis, however, was not destroyed by the simple hand of nature. Instead, the gods themselves were said to have brought ruin upon it. The parallels between the flood of the Bible and the destruction of Atlantis are striking. Both speak of civilizations that had reached the height of their power before their moral decay brought their downfall. Both describe a world of great knowledge and cultural advancement where once noble peoples succumbed to vice and greed. The Atlanteans, like the people in Genesis, were destroyed by a great catastrophe that wiped them from the face of the earth, leaving only a faint memory of their existence behind. Scholars have long debated the true nature of these stories. Some see the biblical flood as a metaphor, a tale meant to impart moral lessons about the dangers of wickedness and the power of divine will. Others suggest that the story may be based on a real historical event, one that was passed down through generations and adapted by different cultures into their own mythologies. Regardless of the interpretation, the flood narrative speaks to a universal truth. Civilizations rise and fall, and the forces of nature are beyond human control. In the case of Atlantis, the flood was not a mere punishment, but a divine act of justice. The gods, angered by the Atlanteans' arrogance and excess, chose to punish them by sinking their great city beneath the waves. The flood, in this sense, was not just a cleansing of the earth, but a rebuke to those who believed themselves above the natural order. Atlantis, a once great civilization, was lost forever, its ruins now only a shadow in the collective memory of humanity. This connection between the biblical flood and the destruction of Atlantis speaks to a deeper truth that transcends both time and culture, that the forces of nature, divine or otherwise, cannot be escaped by the proud and the wicked. Whether it is the wrath of God or the retribution of the gods, the message is clear. No civilization, no matter how mighty, can withstand the forces that shape the world. And in the end, it is not just the land that is destroyed, but the very souls of those who inhabit it. As the floodwaters of the Bible receded, Noah and his family emerged from the ark to a world forever changed. The earth was barren, a blank slate waiting to be repopulated and restored. It was a fresh beginning, but also a reminder of the fragility of life and the transient nature of human achievement. The story of Noah and the ark, while deeply rooted in faith, is also a universal tale of the rise and fall of civilizations and the enduring lessons that can be drawn from the past. Much like Atlantis, the world after the flood was a place of rebirth and renewal, but also of caution. For in both stories, the Great Flood serves as a reminder that no civilization is immune to the ravages of time, and no culture can escape the consequences of its actions. The waters of the flood may have receded, but the lessons they left behind continue to ripple through history, reminding humanity of its place in the grand, unyielding cycle of life and death. In the quiet hush before the storm, as Noah stood at the edge of the ark, his eyes fixed upon the horizon, a deep melancholy settled over him. The world, as he knew it, was ending. The great flood, the divine cleansing, was about to descend upon the earth, a deluge that would wash away all the wickedness that had taken root in the hearts of men. He thought with a somber reflection on how far humanity had fallen from its original state of grace, and how the same force that was about to destroy it had once been its guardian. The ark, a massive wooden vessel, creaked under the strain of anticipation, its wood groaning as the first winds of the storm began to howl. Around him the earth seemed to hold its breath, as though it too understood the magnitude of what was coming. The animals, grouped together in their enclosures, were restless. Noah's family moved with quiet determination, but there was an undercurrent of fear beneath their steady movements, a fear not just of the storm, but of the unknown that lay ahead. Noah turned away from the horizon and surveyed the ark, its great wooden beams rising high above him as if to defy the storm. He had built it according to the Lord's command, and in his heart he knew this was the last refuge for all that was good. But the flood was not just a physical cleansing, it was a reckoning for the sins of man. The wickedness that had spread across the land had reached its peak, and now the world would be judged. Yet even as the winds picked up, even as the first raindrops began to fall, Noah could not escape the feeling that there was something more to this event, something that stretched beyond his own people. "Father," said Shem, his eldest son, breaking Noah's reverie. His voice was steady, but there was an edge of fear beneath it. "How can we be sure? How can we know that we are the ones chosen?" Noah looked at him, his heart heavy with the burden of his knowledge. "The Lord has spoken, Shem, and we are his chosen. All others have turned from righteousness, and the earth must be purged of their evil. The flood is his will. We must trust that his plan is just." Shem nodded, but Noah could see the uncertainty in his eyes. It was not easy, this faith. The storm outside had not yet reached its peak, but its ominous promise hung in the air like a shadow. "It is not just our land that is to be destroyed," Noah continued, his voice tinged with the sorrow of the truth. "The world will change, and when the waters recede, only the pure shall remain." As the days passed, the flood waters rose steadily. The ark rocked gently in the swelling sea, its timbers creaking under the strain. But within its walls there was a sense of calm, a waiting. Time had become fluid, stretched and distorted by the never-ending deluge. The family settled into the rhythm of their new life, moving among the animals, caring for them, keeping watch over the ark's integrity. Noah's thoughts, however, often wandered back to the world that was no more. He thought of the ancient days, the time before the fall, when mankind had lived in peace. In those days, the earth had been a paradise, untouched by the corruption that would later spread across it. Adam, the first man, had walked naked in the Garden of Eden, innocent in his existence, living in harmony with the Creator and the land. His life had been simple, pure. He had lived by the fruits of the earth, untouched by the toil and struggle that would come with civilization. But even Adam, in his innocence, had not been immune to the temptation of knowledge, of self-awareness. The fall had come not because of a single act of defiance, but because humanity had reached too far, had sought too much, and in doing so had corrupted its very nature. Adam had clothed himself in leaves, then in the skins of animals, marking the first step away from the innocence of Eden. From that moment, humanity began its slow march away from the Creator and toward the cities, the tools, the very culture that would one day lead to its destruction. His son Abel had been the first to tend flocks, to shepherd animals, while his brother Cain had been the first to build a city, a place of gathering, of civilization, where men would come together and for a time live in peace. But that peace was fragile, and it shattered as greed and pride took root. From Cain the builder came Tubal-Cain, the first metallurgist, whose hands forged the weapons that would eventually be used for destruction. Jabal had been the first to keep cattle, and Jubal the first to create music, the sounds of which would one day drown out the call to righteousness. These were the stages by which mankind advanced, each step further away from the purity of Eden. And yet in those advances there had been a fall into wickedness, into corruption. The Bible spoke of the sons of God, the divine beings who had walked among men, and their union with the daughters of men, an intermingling of the divine and the mortal that had given birth to mighty and sinful beings, the Nephilim, whose very existence had polluted the earth. It was this mingling, this degradation of the divine race that had led to mankind's downfall. Noah thought of Plato's words about Atlantis, the lost civilization, a powerful and populous land that had risen to great heights before being swallowed by the sea. In many ways, the story of Atlantis mirrored the story of mankind. Plato's tale spoke of a civilization that had once lived in peace, in harmony with the gods, only to be undone by its own excess and wickedness. It, too, had been destroyed by water, a great catastrophe that erased all but a few traces of its grandeur. The parallels were striking. The Bible, too, spoke of a great destruction, a flood that would cleanse the earth of the evil that had taken root. And yet, even as Noah waited for the flood to do its work, he wondered, could the story of Atlantis, too, be true? Could this flood, this divine judgment, be a cleansing not just for his people, but for all mankind, all lands, all civilizations that had risen and fallen through the ages? Noah had always believed the flood to be a singular event, a divine act meant to purify his world. But as he thought of the tales of Atlantis, of a great civilization that had fallen due to its own wickedness, he could not help but feel that there was more to this story, more to the flood, more to the loss of so much of human history than he had ever known. Atlantis, like the world of Noah, had been built by men who had risen from a savage existence, from the innocence of Eden, to create cities, tools, music, and all the trappings of civilization. And yet, like the ancient world, it had been consumed by its own corruption. The floodwaters continued to rise, but Noah knew that what had been lost would never return. What would remain would be the purity of the earth, the promise of a new beginning. And yet, in his heart, he wondered what would be left of the ancient tales, of Atlantis, of the first men, of the civilizations that had come before. Were they all just echoes of a forgotten past, washed away by the same waters that now surrounded him? Or were they, too, part of a greater cycle, a cycle of rise and fall, of creation and destruction that had always defined the world? Noah closed his eyes, and as the storm howled outside, he made peace with the unknown. The flood would come, and the world would be cleansed. But the lessons of the past, the lessons of Atlantis, of the rise and fall of mankind, would not be forgotten. They would live on in the whispers of the wind, in the sound of the rain, and in the hearts of those who would rebuild the world. The Chaldean deluge. The air of the ancient temple was heavy with the scent of burning incense, thick and sweet, curling around the worn stone pillars that seemed to absorb centuries of secrets. Beneath the flickering oil lamps, the dusty scrolls of old Chaldean texts lay scattered across the table, their cuneiform script both foreign and familiar. Amidst these, one story stood out. its echoes reverberating through time, connecting myth with history in a way that seemed almost palpable. Xisuthros, the long-reigning king of the antediluvian world, sat at the edge of the great stone bench, his eyes dimmed by age but his mind sharp, as though he could still hear the voice of Kronos, or Ea, as the god was known in this place. The flood, that cataclysmic event that wiped away almost all life, had been foretold to him in a dream, a vision so vivid that it burned itself into his memory. On the 15th of Daisios, the god had commanded, his voice soft as the wind that rustled the reeds of the Euphrates, all men shall perish in a great deluge. You, Xisuthros, must prepare. And so he had. Build a vessel, he whispered, the words coming unbidden, as if the gods themselves still breathed within him. His mind took him back to that fateful day, his hands trembling as they grasped the tools to create something that would preserve life, his life, and that of the creatures he had sworn to protect. He had obeyed, gathering wood, stone, and metals, building a vessel 5 stadia long, its walls reinforced with asphalt to make it watertight. The animals, birds, and his family were brought aboard, each with a place in the great ship that would carry them across the abyss of water that would soon sweep away the world as they knew it. But the gods were not finished with him yet. When the floodwaters finally came, Xisuthros' heart ached with the heavy weight of destiny. The first birds he released returned quickly, their wings heavy with mud. When he loosed them a second time, they brought back the same result. It was only on the third try, when the birds did not return at all, that Xisuthros knew the earth had been stripped bare, the floodwaters having claimed everything. As the rain ceased, and the ship settled on the top of a mountain, Xisuthros made his way to the deck, his family in tow. The world was still and silent, save for the calls of distant birds who had found the land again. It was then that Xisuthros heard it, a voice from the heavens, speaking in the soft but unmistakable tones of the divine. Xisuthros, the voice called, and it filled his heart with an eerie calm. You have been chosen. You and your family shall dwell with the gods. In a dream, he had been told that his journey would not end in mere survival. No, he was destined to transcend the flood, to live amongst the gods themselves. His wife, his daughter, the pilot who had steered them through the tempest, they too were to join him in the heavens. They were to return to Babylon to recover the writings left behind in Sippara and to share their knowledge with humankind once more. These decrees were divine, sealed by fate and the will of the gods. But even as he stood upon the mountaintop, the weight of his immortality pressing upon him like the very heavens, a part of Xisuthros longed for the familiar soil of his homeland. His feet, still rooted in the now barren earth, knew that the voice had spoken the truth. He had seen the future, a future not bound to the fleeting mortality of men, but to the endless horizon of the divine. In the distance, the mountains of Armenia stood as silent witnesses to the end of one world and the birth of another. The great ship that had carried them through the flood now lay anchored in a valley, its timbers creaking and groaning under the weight of history. Xisuthros' people, those who had not perished in the flood, came to see it, to scrape the asphalt from its remains and carry it away, using it as a talisman to ward off evil spirits. It was a strange irony, he thought, how something as destructive as the flood had now become a source of protection. The gods had granted him and his companions a new life, but with that gift came the knowledge of their duty to rebuild, to lay the foundations of the future. The people of Babylon would once again learn of the gods' will, and they would carry it with them as they built cities anew, restoring what had been lost. Xisuthros would lead them, not as a mortal king, but as one of the divine, his role transcending the temporal into the eternal. It was then that the scene before him shifted, and his mind was drawn to another version of this story, another telling, older still, though equally compelling. A tale found in the cuneiform tablets that had been exhumed from the ruins of Nineveh, where scholars had deciphered the ancient writings of the Chaldean priests. These texts spoke of a different hero, Khasisatra, whose name had become synonymous with survival. In this telling, the deluge came not as a warning to one king, but as a decree from the gods themselves. Khasisatra, the text began, heard the voice of Ea, the god who whispered the doom of the earth in his dream. The story unfolded in the ancient city of Shuruppak, a city on the banks of the Euphrates, where Khasisatra, a humble servant of the gods, was commanded to build a ship, a vessel whose dimensions seemed impossible for a man of his means. Yet the gods had spoken, and the vision was clear. 600 cubits long, 60 cubits wide, the ship was a feat of divine intervention. And though the people mocked him, though they laughed at the absurdity of it all, Khasisatra did not waver. The flood came, as it always does in these stories, swelling from the depths of the earth and the sky, bringing destruction to the world. But in this version, the gods themselves, now frantic and grieving for the suffering they had caused, witnessed the calamity they had set in motion. The great goddess Ishtar wept, mourning the death of humanity, while Ea, the god of wisdom, lamented that the fate of men could not be undone. On the seventh day, when the storm had subsided, Khasisatra sent out his dove, his swallow, and finally the raven, each returning with the grim news: the earth was barren, the waters had claimed everything. But even in the desolation, there was hope. Khasisatra offered sacrifices, invoking the favor of the gods, praying that humanity might be reborn, that the earth might be restored. As he stood there, contemplating the weight of these two stories, the ancient Babylonian tale and the version he knew from his own memory, Xisuthros felt a deep sense of both responsibility and relief. The flood had washed the world clean, but it had also granted him the chance to guide the survivors toward a new dawn. He had been chosen not only to live, but to ensure that the story would live on. And so, as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across the land, Xisuthros, now known as Khasisatra in these new myths, prepared to return. The writings, the sacred texts, the knowledge of the gods, they would be restored. The cycle would continue, as it always had and as it always would. But the memory of the flood, the pain of that destruction, would never fade. It was woven into the fabric of humanity, a warning for those who would listen, and a promise for those who would survive. And through it all, the gods watched, knowing that they too were bound to this world and to the endless tide of fate. Berosus's account, the first version of the Chaldean deluge myth, as presented by Berosus, was extracted from the sacred books of Babylon and recorded for the Greeks. This account is more concise and serves as a historical document summarizing the events surrounding the Great Flood. According to Berosus, the story begins with the reign of Xisuthros, also known as Khasisatra, who ruled after his father Obartes el-Baratutu. His reign spanned a staggering 64,800 years, a reflection of the immense duration of pre-flood times in Babylonian lore. The deluge under Xisuthros was not an arbitrary event, but a divine judgment, as the god Kronos, interpreted as Ea, the Babylonian god of wisdom and waters, warned him through a dream. In this vision, Kronos revealed that all mankind would perish in a great flood on the 15th day of Dasios, which corresponds to the Assyrian month of Sivan, just before the summer solstice. The god's instructions were clear. Xisuthros was to gather written records, presumably sacred knowledge, and bury them in the city of the sun at Sippara. He was then to build a vessel large enough to house his family, closest friends, and representatives of every living species. As for the direction of the ship's journey, Xisuthros was told to steer toward the gods and pray for the well-being of humanity. After following the divine mandate, Xisuthros constructed a massive vessel measuring 5 stadia, approximately 900 feet in length and width. He embarked on the ship with his family and a host of animals, prepared for the flood that was to come. The floodwaters did indeed arrive, but soon began to recede. Xisuthros released birds, first a raven, then a dove and a swallow, to check the state of the world. Initially, the birds returned, but after the third release, the dove did not return, signaling that the earth had become barren. Xisuthros then opened the ship's roof and saw that it had come to rest on a mountain. He descended with his wife, daughter, and the ship's pilot, who performed a sacrifice to the gods. At that moment, the divine intervention was clear. A voice from the heavens declared that Xisuthros, his family, and the pilot had been rewarded for their piety by being granted immortality. The voice instructed the survivors to return to Babylon and recover the sacred writings buried at Sippara to share the knowledge with mankind. The vessel itself was said to have landed in the Armenian mountains, where parts of it could still be seen in Berossus's time, with pilgrims collecting fragments for use in protective rituals against witchcraft. After the deluge, Xisuthros' companions returned to Babylon, re-established the city, and began spreading the teachings inscribed in the sacred documents. The Epic of Gilgamesh account. In contrast to Berossus's version, the account found in the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the Epic of Gilgamesh's 11th tablet, presents the deluge as part of a larger epic where it is narrated through the words of the hero, Khasisatra, also identified with Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. This version has much more complex narrative layers interwoven with themes of immortality, human fate, and the relationship between gods and men. The story begins in the ancient city of Shuripak, located on the Euphrates, where the gods convene and decide to destroy humanity due to its corrupt nature. Anu, Baal, and other gods agree that a deluge should be unleashed to wipe out the earth's inhabitants. However, Ea, the god of wisdom and water, equivalent to Kronos in Berossus's account, intervenes by revealing the divine plan to Khasisatra in a dream. Ea instructs Khasisatra to build a massive vessel, ensuring that he, his family, and the seeds of all life will be preserved. This divine warning marks a sharp departure from human corruption, a step towards survival amid cosmic devastation. The dimensions of the boat are specific: 600 cubits long, approximately 1,000 feet, 60 cubits wide and high, enormous by any measure. Khasisatra is told to bring aboard his family, his servants, the beasts of the field, and wild animals. The preparation of the boat is described with a certain ritualistic gravity, with the construction taking 7 days, including the gathering of provisions, including grains, cattle, and foodstuffs, to survive the cataclysm. When the flood arrives, it is a cataclysmic force that consumes the earth. The flood waters rise and ravage the landscape as the gods themselves are terrified by the disaster they have set in motion. The Epic of Gilgamesh emphasizes the chaos and destruction, where the brother no longer saw his brother, and the gods became afraid of the water spout. Even the gods retreat to higher realms to escape the flood. Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, wails in grief, lamenting the destruction of humanity, while the gods, helpless against the flood, weep for the humans they once created. For 6 days and nights, the flood rages. By the 7th day, the rain finally ceases, and Khasisatra opens the window of the ship to survey the damage. He sees that the entire world is covered with water, and humanity had returned to mud. He releases a dove, but it returns, not finding a place to land. A swallow is sent out with the same result. Finally, a raven is released, and it does not return, signaling that the waters had receded enough for the raven to find food on the land. In the aftermath, Khasisatra performs a sacrifice to the gods, thanking them for his survival. The gods respond favorably, and the deities, even those who had originally caused the flood, show signs of reconciliation. The gods are depicted as drawn to the smoke of the sacrifice, and Bel, who had initially been opposed to the survival of humans, is persuaded to allow Khasisatra and his wife to ascend to immortality. The tale concludes with Khasisatra and his wife being carried away to a distant land where they live among the gods, no longer part of the mortal world. The message of the flood myth, as revealed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is deeply tied to the themes of human frailty, divine intervention, and the search for immortality. Khasisatra, like Gilgamesh, seeks answers about life and death, but in the end, he is granted the gift of eternal life, a rare divine privilege. the deluge of the Chaldeans. In the warm, dust-choked air of ancient Babylon, the very earth seemed to tremble with the weight of the divine. The people, gripped by terror and awe, gathered in the shadow of the towering ziggurats, where the gods themselves were believed to dwell. But a darker fear whispered among the priests and scholars was soon to be realized. Kronos. The name hung in the air like a forgotten prophecy, a warning, a storm on the horizon. It was said that the god of time, often known as Saturn, had once ruled over a vast kingdom, a kingdom lost to the ages, swallowed by the sea. This god was more than myth. He was said to have been a king, a bringer of civilization to the distant lands of Italy, where he founded the Golden Age. It was he, the god of the Atlantic Ocean, who had first ruled the seas and the lands beyond. And now from that same ocean he sent his warning. Berosus, the wise scholar and priest of the ancient Chaldeans, recorded it. In a dream, Kronos appeared before Xisuthros, the king of the old world. A deluge was coming, a flood from the abyss, and all would perish. The tale of the great flood was not one of mere rainfall. The people believed, with every fiber of their being, that the earth would be swallowed whole by the vast and endless ocean. The gods, angry and vengeful, had determined that humanity's time had come. But one man, Xisuthros, had been warned, his fate tied to a legacy far older than Babylon itself. "Prepare yourself," the voice of Kronos had said, "for the end is nigh. Gather your people, your kin, and your treasures. Build a ship to carry you across the waters." And so Xisuthros, guided by the gods, began the task. His hands, weathered by time, carved wood into shape. His eyes, dark with the knowledge of the old world, scanned the skies above the Euphrates. The ship was to be no ordinary vessel, but one to weather the very fury of the gods. With the prow cutting sharply through the waves, the ark, unlike any seen before, would navigate the vast ocean, guided by a purpose known only to the divine. Yet even as the men labored in their work, the weight of fate pressed down upon them. The prophecy had been clear. The flood would come not in a trickle, but with the full force of nature, an end to the world as they knew it. The sea, which had long been the domain of Kronos, was now to be their enemy. The day of reckoning arrived with a chill in the air, a heaviness that settled in the bones of those who knew the truth. Xisuthros stood at the prow of the ark, his hands gripping the rail as the winds began to stir. His heart pounded with a fear he had never known, for the gods had said it would not be a mere rainstorm that would come. No, this would be a cataclysm, a war of the elements themselves. As the winds howled and thunder cracked across the sky, the first raindrops fell, but it was no gentle shower. The heavens seemed to open, as if the very ocean itself was spilling over the sky. The storm raged for 7 days and 7 nights, and the waters of the Euphrates rose higher and higher. The earth groaned under the pressure of the floodwaters, and the land that had once been fertile and full of life began to disappear, swallowed by the relentless surge. Xisuthros stood firm. The ark, a testament to the wisdom of the gods, remained steady upon the waves. His family, his closest companions, huddled below deck, clutching each other as the storm threatened to tear the world asunder. Above them, the world had ceased to be. The rain, thick and unrelenting, beat down upon the ark as though the gods themselves were angry. It was not just rain. No, there was thunder and lightning, a fierce, violent fury that could only come from the depths of the abyss. Earthquakes shook the very foundations of the land, and a great waterspout rose from the ocean, a twisting, monstrous thing that threatened to consume them all. Brother no longer saw brother, the ancient texts would say. Men no longer knew each other. The flood swept away entire cities, swept away all traces of life until nothing but the raging sea remained. The world was filled with mud, and corpses, once human, now floated like seaweed in the churning waters. For 7 days the storm did not relent. Xisuthros' ship rode the waves, a lone survivor in a world that had been swept clean of life. His heart ached with the knowledge of what had been lost. But there was no time for sorrow. The ark pressed on, its course set by the will of the gods. On the seventh day, the storm finally began to ease. The rain tapered off, and the thunder quieted to a distant rumble. It was then that Xisuthros dared to open the hatch, his eyes squinting against the light of the broken sky. The ark had come to rest upon the side of a great mountain, its jagged peaks rising from the sea like the remnants of a forgotten world. And so Xisuthros sent out the first bird, a raven, watching as it circled in the air. But it returned, its wings heavy with the weight of the flood. Next a dove was sent, followed by a swallow. Each returned with no sign of dry land. But finally the raven did not return. The land, it seemed, was beginning to re-emerge. With great reverence, Xisuthros and his companions emerged from the ark. They offered thanks to the gods who had spared them and performed sacrifices to honor their survival. The flood had receded, but the world was not the same. The land was barren, devoid of life, save for the few remnants that had survived. The gods, pleased by the offering, spoke to Xisuthros, "You have been faithful, and you have survived. You and your family shall be immortal, for you have seen the end of the world and lived to tell it." And so, as the waters of the flood slowly receded, the people of Babylon began to rebuild. But the story of the deluge, of the great warning from Kronos, was passed down through the generations. The land of Kronos, the ocean world, Atlantis, these were all connected in the minds of those who heard the tale. And as Berosus had written, the Pillars of Hercules, the gates to the lost world, were once known as the Pillars of Kronos. For the flood that had swept away their world had also opened the door to a new age, a new understanding of the gods, and a new legend that would echo through time. In the distant reaches of the ancient world, the tale of the great flood would be told and retold, each version reflecting the deep-seated belief in the cyclical nature of time, of destruction and rebirth. For as Xisuthros and his family stood upon the mountain's peak, gazing at the desolate world below, they knew that the gods had granted them not just survival, but the knowledge of a world lost to the waves, a world that would live forever in the hearts of those who dared to remember. The ocean's wrath, the Chaldean deluge. The air was thick with anticipation as the priests of Babylon, garbed in their ceremonial robes, whispered beneath the great ziggurats. The city, at the crossroads of time and fate, was alive with the murmurs of prophecy, old legends resurfacing, heavy with meaning. The people of this ancient city, steeped in the mysteries of the past, could feel the weight of something imminent, a reckoning foretold by the gods themselves. Berosus, the scholar and priest of Babylon, had long studied the ancient texts, the stars, and the gods' whispered words. And in these dark times, he knew that a great flood, a cataclysm unlike any seen before, was about to sweep the earth. But this was no mere flood. The god who had warned of the coming destruction was none other than Kronos, an ancient god whose name echoed through time, a name that in the distant past had been synonymous with the lost land of Atlantis. Kronos, Berosus whispered, his voice tremulous. It was he who warned the people of the coming deluge. The god's name resonated with power. Kronos was the same as Saturn, the king who, long before the founding of Rome, had brought civilization to the people of Italy. Saturn had taught them agriculture, established order, and created the Golden Age. But when he had completed his divine mission, Saturn had been called away to the abodes of the gods. His story, as the scholars had long known, was intertwined with a great ocean world, a continent lost to time, and a kingdom that spanned the Mediterranean from northern Africa to the shores of Italy, even extending to the islands in the sea. It was said that the Romans, in awe of their ancient gods, called the Atlantic Ocean Cronium Mare, the Sea of Kronos, linking the god to the very waters that surrounded the lost land of Atlantis. The great Pillars of Hercules, the gateway to the known world, had been called the Pillars of Kronos by the ancients, marking a boundary between the world of the living and the forgotten realms beyond. Could this be the land we have lost? Berosus thought aloud, his eyes narrowing in contemplation. The same land spoken of by Plato, the dominion of Atlantis, submerged beneath the waves. The more he pondered, the more the pieces fell into place. The land described in the ancient Chaldean texts was the ocean world, Atlantis itself. The warning came swiftly, like a sudden storm. The god Hea, or Ea, who had once brought civilization and knowledge to the ancient peoples of the seas, was not of rivers or lakes. He was a god of the abyss, the ocean that held both secrets and salvation. His form, half man, half fish, reflected his deep connection to the waters that stretched beyond the horizon. Hea was a god whose knowledge transcended the bounds of ordinary mortals. It was said that Hea had taught the ancient people how to navigate the seas and had brought them the arts of writing and civilization, but at a terrible cost. The land of the gods will be no more, Hea had foreseen, his voice as deep and cold as the waters he ruled. The flood will come and all will be lost. Only those who heed my warning will survive. As the storm approached, the winds of the ocean began to churn, and the ground beneath Babylon seemed to tremble. The people gathered, fearful of the impending cataclysm. But Xisuthros, the wise king, understood that his time had come. He had heard the gods' call, and now the time to act had arrived. "Kronos!" Xisuthros called out, standing at the edge of the Euphrates, the river now swollen with unnatural rains. "Your prophecy shall come to pass." He hurried to the workshop where his engineers labored. The ark, no mere chest but a mighty vessel, a ship fit to weather the storm of the gods, was being constructed. The ark, unlike the simple coffer of Genesis, had a prow and a stern, and its timbers were bound with strength that could endure the sea. The sea. This was where the destruction would come from, for the waters of the world would not rise from the land but from the abyss itself. For 7 days the heavens wept. But it was not merely rain that fell upon the earth. A tremendous storm of thunder and lightning, winds and earthquakes ravaged the land. The waters rose, not as a trickle, but as an overwhelming tide, swallowing cities, forests, and mountains alike. Xisuthros, aboard his great ship, felt the fury of the gods as the seas churned and thunder shook the heavens. The storm was unlike anything the earth had seen before, and it seemed to rage with the force of an ancient grudge. The water rises to the sky. The people cried in fear, witnessing the destruction that tore apart their world. Brothers no longer saw their brothers, and men no longer knew each other. The earth became a sea, and the sky a mist of destruction. The flood filled the land, the dead floating like seaweed, as the gods fought together in a final, all-consuming cataclysm. "The world is gone," one of the survivors screamed as the land disappeared beneath the waters. "There is no longer any continent." Days turned to weeks as the storm continued, and Xisuthros navigated his ark across the vast, endless sea. He had been warned, but the reality of it, the true weight of the destruction, was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The sea had swallowed the land whole, and all that remained was a dark, silent ocean. It was said that after many days of sailing, Xisuthros finally came upon dry land, but this was not the world he had once known. The flood had wiped it clean, leaving only remnants of the old world behind. The mountains that had once been home to countless civilizations were now but peaks in a vast, empty ocean. "We have been granted a second chance," Xisuthros said, his voice filled with reverence and awe. "The gods have allowed us to survive, but the world we knew is no more. We must begin anew." And so Xisuthros and his people set foot upon the remnants of the land, knowing that their survival was a gift from the gods. The deluge had been a cleansing, a reminder of the old world's fragility, and the land of Atlantis had vanished beneath the sea. Yet the echoes of that lost kingdom remained in the stories of those who survived, the stories of a world ruled by Kronos, the god of time and the ocean, who had once ruled over a kingdom that spanned the Mediterranean and beyond to the farthest reaches of the Atlantic. The pillars of Hercules, Berosus had said in his studies, were the gateways to that lost world, the entrance to the realm of Kronos, the god of the Atlantic. And though the world had been swallowed by the waters, the memory of Atlantis remained in the hearts of those who had been left behind. The flood had passed, but the echoes of Atlantis, the ocean world, remained, its name whispered in the winds, and its legacy carved into the myths of all who survived. The story of the great flood was not just a tale of destruction, but of rebirth, a new world rising from the ruins of the old, the deluge of other nations. The waters of Deucalion. The sun had set, casting long shadows across the ancient city of Hierapolis, and the temple to Atargatis, the Syrian goddess of fertility, stood in the fading light as a silent testament to a time long past. It was here, in this sacred space, that the people gathered, pilgrims from distant lands, some from across the Euphrates, others from the heart of Syria and Arabia. Their purpose was not only religious, but also deeply rooted in the history of the earth itself. The stories of the great deluge were told and retold in hushed tones, passed down from generation to generation. It was said that in the time of Deucalion, the first human race had been wiped from the face of the earth, destroyed by the wrath of the gods. They had been prideful and wicked, neglecting their oaths, turning away from the laws of hospitality, and disregarding the rights of the gods. Their punishment had come swiftly, an immense flood that drowned the land. Among the crowd stood the scholar Lysias, a man whose understanding of ancient myth and history had brought him to this very place. His mind often wandered through the vast labyrinth of legends and traditions, searching for connections that linked the people of the past with the divine. He had long heard of the tale of Deucalion, but now, standing at the temple where the story had been passed down, he could feel the weight of the ancient history that surrounded him. "It is said," he began, speaking softly to a fellow traveler from across the sea, "that the race of men we belong to is not the first. No, the first was lost to the waters, wiped away by the wrath of the gods." The traveler, a man from the shores of the Mediterranean, nodded. "Yes, I've heard this. The ancient Greeks tell us of Deucalion, how he alone survived the great flood. His piety, his devotion to the gods, was the reason he was spared. His was the only family that remained when the waters receded." Lysias paused, his gaze drawn to the narrow chasm beneath the temple, a relic of the earth's violent past. The chasm, which had once been wide and deep, was now little more than a crack in the earth, but it was here that the waters had been said to have poured during the deluge, swallowed into the bosom of the earth. The priest spoke of it often, as if the very crack in the earth was a reminder of the power of the flood. He gestured toward the chasm. "Here, it is said, the waters were swallowed, where the earth opened up and absorbed all that had been lost." A priest who had overheard Lysias's words stepped forward. He was an old man, his face lined with the wisdom of many years, and his eyes held the quiet certainty of one who had spent a lifetime in the service of the gods. "It is true," the priest said in a low voice. "The waters did not simply rise from the heavens, they were drawn into the earth. As the Quran tells us, the tanur, the oven, began to bubble and disgorge water. And it is here, in this very chasm, where the waters were swallowed, that the memory of the deluge is preserved." The travelers exchanged glances, their thoughts a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had heard the Quran's cryptic reference to the Tanur, but they had not known of its connection to this ancient site. Lysias, ever the scholar, was eager to uncover more. "And the flood?" he asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Was it truly a punishment from the gods, or was there something more, something deeper to this tale?" The priest nodded, a slight smile crossing his lips. "The flood was a punishment, yes, but also a cleansing. It washed away the first race, those who had become arrogant and wicked, their hearts filled with pride. The gods saw the corruption of mankind and decided to begin anew, to give the earth a fresh start." Lysias frowned. "But what of Deucalion? How did he survive?" The priest's eyes grew distant, as if lost in the depths of time. Deucalion was chosen by the gods for his virtue and piety. He and his family were spared, but it was not by chance. Deucalion built a great coffer, a vessel in which he placed himself, his wife, his children, and all the creatures of the earth. Pigs, horses, lions, serpents, they all came to him, seeking refuge. In that coffer they were safe. And within it a miracle occurred. The animals, once natural enemies, lived in harmony, guided by the gods. The scholar was fascinated. And after the flood receded, what happened then? After the flood, the priest continued, Deucalion and his family were the only ones left. They descended from the mountain where they had come to rest and began the work of repopulating the earth. It was Deucalion who brought forth a new race of men, a people born from the floodwaters, a people who would honor the gods and the earth. Lysias pondered these words, his mind racing with the implications. He had long known that the story of Deucalion was not unique to the Greeks, but is it not strange, he mused aloud, that this tale appears not only here in Hierapolis, but across many lands? The Koran, the Bible, the Chaldeans, they all speak of a great flood, of a race of men who were destroyed, and of a new people who rose from the waters. The priest's gaze sharpened. It is no coincidence, my friend. The legends of the flood are not bound by the borders of nations or religions. They echo across time, across cultures, because they are the truth of our beginnings. The waters were the cleansing, the reset of the world. And we are the descendants of those who were spared. As the conversation waned, the pilgrims began their ritual, pouring seawater into the chasm as they had done for centuries. The water disappeared into the earth, just as the flood waters had been swallowed long ago. It was a solemn act, a way of preserving the memory of the past, of honoring the gods who had granted them life. Lysias watched the water vanish into the earth, and a deep sense of connection to the past filled him. The chasm, the great flood, the gods, he understood now that these were not merely stories. They were the foundation of all things, a shared heritage that connected humanity across time and space. As the last drops of water disappeared into the earth, the crowd dispersed, leaving Lysias standing alone by the chasm. The temple stood silent, its walls echoing with the voices of 1,000 generations, each one carrying the weight of the deluge and the promise of rebirth. The waters had once washed away the world, but from their depths a new world had emerged, the waters of Manu, a tale across time. The sun had just begun to rise over the lush, verdant landscape of ancient India. The air was thick with the morning mist, a soft blanket that clung to the earth as it stretched toward the horizon. In the distance, the great rivers of the land wound through the terrain like silver serpents, their waters glistening in the early light. It was here, by the sacred river, that the sage Manu began his day, unaware of the divine encounter that would soon alter the course of his life. Manu, a man of wisdom and deep reverence for the gods, stood on the bank, preparing himself for his morning ablutions. His hands, calloused from years of study and contemplation, dipped into the cool water as he reached for the vessel that would carry the water for his purification. As he lifted the water, something unexpected brushed against his palm, a small fish struggling to remain in his grasp. He gazed at the creature curiously. Its scales shimmered with an ethereal glow, as if it were not entirely of this world. The fish flopped slightly in his hand, its body warm and pulsing with an urgent energy. "Protect me," it said, its voice clear in his mind, "and I will save you." Manu, startled, blinked in disbelief. "Save me? From what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A deluge will come," the fish replied. "It will sweep all creatures from the earth, leaving nothing but the waters. But I will save you if you protect me." "How?" Manu inquired, unsure whether the fish was a sign from the gods or merely a figment of his imagination. The fish's voice grew calm, its words purposeful. "At first, keep me in a small vase. When I outgrow it, place me in a larger basin. And when I am too large for that, release me into the ocean. Then, When the time comes, I will guide you to safety." Manu, though puzzled, felt an undeniable pull in the fish's words, a sense of fate that stirred deep within him. He followed the creature's instructions, placing it in the vase and then, as it grew, transferring it into larger vessels. Over time, the fish's size increased until it was an immense, shimmering being, its presence radiating a quiet, powerful energy. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of fiery reds and oranges, the fish spoke again, its voice now heavy with certainty. "The deluge will come this year. Build a vessel, Manu, and worship me. When the waters rise, enter the vessel. I will save you." And so Manu, obeying the divine command, gathered the materials needed to construct a great ship. He did not hesitate, knowing that the time of reckoning was upon him. He spent days preparing, crafting a vessel sturdy enough to withstand the floodwaters that were sure to come. And when the vessel was complete, he performed the rituals of worship, calling upon the gods to guide him through the coming storm. The days passed, the air growing heavy with the scent of rain. Then one morning the skies darkened and the first drops of water began to fall. It started as a gentle patter, but within moments the rain grew fierce, a torrential downpour that seemed to consume the earth itself. The rivers swelled, bursting their banks, and the winds howled as the seas rose, covering the land in a vast, unrelenting wave. Manu, having secured himself within the vessel, looked to the horizon where he saw the great fish approaching. It glided through the floodwaters, its massive form cutting through the waves with ease. The fish swam up to the ship, its eyes glowing with ancient wisdom. "Fasten the vessel to my horn," the fish commanded, its voice a deep, resonant hum. "I will carry you over the mountain of the north where you will be safe." With reverence, Manu took the rope that had been prepared and tied it securely to the fish's horn. The vessel was pulled through the waters, carried by the divine creature, as the world around him drowned. The rain continued for days, and Manu watched as the landscape he had known disappeared beneath the relentless waves. At last, the fish guided the ship to the high mountains where the waters had not yet reached. The fish, its task complete, spoke once more. "I have saved you, Manu. Now fasten the ship to a tree so that the waters may not carry it away while you remain on the mountain." Manu followed the fish's instructions, securing the vessel to the sturdy tree as the waters slowly began to recede. The fish, now fading into the depths of the ocean, offered one final piece of advice. "As the waters diminish, you shall descend. The world will be reborn, and you will be its guide." Manu waited alone on the mountain as the floodwaters slowly withdrew, revealing a world that had been cleansed. In the days that followed, as the waters receded further, Manu descended the mountain, and with him the remnants of life began to return. The animals, the plants, and the people all began to repopulate the earth, starting anew from the ashes of the old world. And so the tale of Manu's survival became legend, passed down through generations, etched into the very fabric of Indian mythology. But as the years passed, the story took on new forms and variations, each telling its own version of the Great Deluge. It was said that in the Puranas, the fish who saved Manu was not merely a fish, but the god Vishnu, incarnated in the form of a divine creature to guide the righteous king Satyavrata, another figure of justice and truth, through the flood waters. The Puranic version, though more fantastical, held within it the same core of divine intervention, a reminder of the eternal cycle of destruction and rebirth. Scholars of ancient texts noted the striking similarities between the Puranic legend and other deluge myths, such as the Chaldean tale of Khasisatra. In the Bhagavata Purana, Vishnu warned Satyavrata of the coming flood, just as the gods had warned Noah in the Bible. The similarities were undeniable. 7 days before the flood, the divine warning had come, and the sacred texts, including the scriptures of the gods, were protected from the destruction by being safely hidden from the wrath of Hayagriva, the marine demon. These connections, scholars argued, pointed to a deep shared tradition, one that spanned across cultures and centuries. each retelling adding its own flavor to the ancient truth of the flood. As Manu descended from the mountain of the north, the world began anew, and the memory of the great fish lived on in the stories of the people. From the waters of the deluge, a new world emerged, a world shaped by divine intervention, guided by wisdom, and built upon the ashes of a world that had perished. And in this new world, the memory of the flood remained a reminder of the fragility of life and the power of the divine to reshape the world with a single cleansing wave. The Garden of Yima, the call of the deluge. The sun dipped low over the craggy hills, casting long shadows over the ancient Persian plains. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sage, and the ground beneath the hooves of the horses seemed to hum with the weight of centuries. On the horizon, a distant pale light gleamed from the high temple of Ahura Mazda, where the eternal fire burned in honor of the Creator. It was here, in the sacred presence of the god, that the world was about to change. Yima, the noble leader of the Iranians, stood at the edge of the great plains, his heart heavy with an unspoken knowledge. As the ruler of the people, he had seen the signs, the slow, ominous darkening of the skies, the restless winds that whispered of calamity. But it was the divine voice of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the ancient world, that had called him to prepare for what was to come. In the deep recesses of his palace, beneath the shadow of towering columns and the weight of ancient wisdom, Yima received the message. The voice of Ahura Mazda echoed in his mind, a booming, ethereal command that reached into the core of his being. Yima, the god's voice rumbled as though it came from the very earth itself. The earth is to be devoured by a flood. The great waters will rise and sweep away all that exists. You must build a refuge, a square garden, a vara, to preserve the life that remains. Gather the seeds of men, beasts, and plants, for only in this sanctuary shall life endure. Yima, a man wise beyond his years, had long known that the cycle of the world was one of creation and destruction. Yet the divine warning stirred a sense of dread unlike anything he had felt before. The flood was not just a natural disaster. It was a divine reckoning. The great waters would cleanse the earth, and only those chosen by Ahura Mazda would survive. With urgency, Yima summoned his people. The air around them was heavy with the murmurs of impending doom, but they listened intently as their leader spoke. "A catastrophe is upon us," Yima announced, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed the turmoil within. "The great flood will come, as decreed by Ahura Mazda. We must act quickly. We will build a sanctuary, a garden, a safe haven, where life will be preserved. I call upon you all to gather the seeds of the earth, the animals of the land, and the wisdom of our ancestors. We shall ensure that life continues, even in the face of annihilation." Under the watchful eyes of their leader, the people worked tirelessly. The square garden took shape in the heart of the land, a place of safety and serenity, protected by high walls that shielded it from the chaos of the outside world. The seeds of crops were carefully gathered, and animals, both wild and domesticated, were herded into the sanctuary. It was a place of preservation, a small island of life in the midst of an impending cataclysm. As the days passed, the skies darkened further, and the winds began to howl with increasing fury. It was clear that the time was near. The gods were preparing to cleanse the earth, and only those within the vara would be spared. And then the flood came. The rains began as a soft mist, but within hours they turned into a torrential downpour. The heavens seemed to crack open, pouring their contents onto the earth in a relentless cascade. The rivers, swollen beyond recognition, burst their banks, and the seas rose with a fury that could not be contained. The earth trembled, and the very foundations of civilization seemed to crumble beneath the weight of the waters. Inside the sanctuary, Yima stood with his people, watching through the high walls as the world around them was consumed. The floodwaters surged, sweeping away villages, trees, and animals, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. The The storm raged for days, as the skies bled with fire and lightning, and the earth seemed to mourn its fate. But in the Vara, all was calm. Amid the devastation, a figure appeared. A bird, its feathers glowing with an otherworldly radiance, flew down from the heavens and landed before Yima. It was Kashipta, the divine messenger of Ahura Mazda. The bird spoke in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, as though it carried the weight of the cosmos within it. The waters have risen and the earth has been cleansed, Kashipta said. You have fulfilled the will of Ahura Mazda. The sanctuary is safe. The seed of life remains, and from this garden a new world shall emerge. Yima nodded solemnly, his heart heavy with both relief and sorrow. He had saved his people, but at what cost? The world outside the Vara was gone, swept away by the wrath of the flood. All that remained was this small, sacred place, a reminder of what had been. As the bird took flight once more, soaring high above the sanctuary, Yima looked to the heavens. He knew that this was not the end, but the beginning of something new. The flood had carried away the old world, but from the seeds of life, a new civilization would grow. Far from the shores of ancient Persia, across the seas and the winds, another great civilization was experiencing its own reckoning. In the lost island of Atlantis, a powerful empire stood on the brink of destruction. The great city, an embodiment of human achievement and divine favor, was about to be swallowed by the ocean. Its people, unaware of the fate that awaited them. The legend of the three worlds, the western continent of Atlantis, the eastern lands of Europe and Africa, and the island itself, had echoed through the ages. Plato had spoken of this vast empire, a civilization that had risen to great heights before its sudden and catastrophic fall. And as the floodwaters rose to claim the earth, the same forces that had shaped the rise of Atlantis would now shape its fall. Poseidon, the god who had once ruled over Atlantis, stood at the edge of the sea, watching as the waters began to rise. His trident, a symbol of his dominion over the sea, gleamed in the dim light. He was the fish god, the ruler of the oceans, and he was watching over his people one final time. In Atlantis, there was no refuge like that of Yima's garden. The people of Atlantis, blinded by their own hubris, did not heed the warning. As the ocean consumed their great city, they fought against the waves, struggling to hold on to the remnants of their once great civilization. Yet, as the sea swallowed the land, the divine intervention of Poseidon was felt. His power surged through the waters, lifting the chosen few to safety, while the rest were lost to the depths. The legend of the flood had come full circle, and as Atlantis sank beneath the waves, a new world, much like the Garden of Yima, would one day rise from the ashes of the old. In the end, the flood was not merely a destructive force, but a purifying one. From its waters, new civilizations would emerge, carrying the memory of the old and the wisdom of the gods. The stories of Yima and Poseidon, of the flood and the salvation, would endure through the ages, woven into the fabric of myth and history, always reminding the world of the fragile nature of life and the power of the divine. The waters of Ogyges and Deucalion's flight. It was an age long past, before the cities of stone, before the temples to gods and the great wars that would shape the world. In the heart of ancient Greece, amidst the golden plains of Boeotia and Attica, the flood waters rose. They came without warning, swallowing the land, blotting out the sun, and submerging the earth in a relentless tide. King Ogyges, the ruler of these lands, stood at the edge of the rising waters. His name, now lost to the fog of myth, was whispered among the elders, his very syllables carrying the weight of a time so ancient that its memory had almost faded from history. The flood was said to be of such magnitude that it reached the heavens, a divine punishment, a cosmic cleansing. Ogyges, however, was no mere man. He had the foresight of the gods, the wisdom of those who understood the ancient ways, and the strength of a king who would fight to protect his people. With his closest companions, Ogyges sought refuge. The storm howled across the plains, the winds howling as if driven by the gods themselves, and the waters surged, devouring everything in their path. "We must flee!" Ogyges shouted. his voice rising above the roar of the tempest. "To the vessel now!" His companions scrambled to follow him, their footsteps heavy in the mud as the rain continued to fall in sheets. The sky seemed to collapse in on itself, a suffocating darkness falling over the land. The great vessel built by Ogyges' hand stood ready, a symbol of hope amidst the devastation. As the floodwaters surged around them, they scrambled aboard, the wooden planks creaking beneath their feet as the storm raged on. With the ship at sea, Ogyges stood at the bow, gazing out into the abyss. The flood had taken everything. The world he knew was gone, lost to the waters, and yet he and his companions floated, the last remnants of a world lost to time. The storm raged on, and the flood continued to rise, but there was no turning back. In the distance, the shore was gone, and all that was left was the endless expanse of water. The land was gone. The people were gone. Only the ship, the survivors, and the endless storm remained. As the years passed and the storm subsided, the world would slowly begin to heal. But the memory of the flood would never fade, and in time, another legend would arise, one even older than that of Ogyges, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The temple of Zeus stood tall above the plains of Thessaly, its marble pillars gleaming in the light of the morning sun. It was here that the gods watched over the land, their eyes ever vigilant, ever judging. Zeus, the king of the gods, had seen the errors of mankind. The men of the age of bronze were wicked, their hearts filled with greed and violence. The world had become corrupt, and Zeus, in his wrath, decided to cleanse the earth. The flood was his punishment. In the shadow of the great temple, Deucalion, son of Prometheus, pondered the divine warning that had been given to him. His father, the Titan, had always stood apart from the gods, seeking to protect mankind from their capricious whims, and now Prometheus had given Deucalion a task to survive the coming flood, to preserve life on earth. Deucalion turned to his wife Pyrrha, who stood by his side, her face pale with fear. "The flood will come," he said, his voice filled with resolve, "but we will survive. We will be the ones to carry the seed of life into the future." Pyrrha nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. "How will we survive, my husband? How can we save what remains of humanity when the gods have decreed its destruction?" Deucalion's eyes were steady, his thoughts clear. "I will build a coffer, a chest, and we will take refuge in it. We will be carried upon the waves as the floodwaters rise and devour the earth. We will endure." And so Deucalion built a coffer. It was a simple vessel crafted from wood and bound with pitch, but it would carry them through the storm. As the clouds darkened above and the first drops of rain began to fall, Deucalion and Pyrrha climbed into the coffer, their hands clasped together, their hearts heavy with the weight of their task. The storm came swiftly, the winds howling and the rains falling in torrents. For 9 days and 9 nights the coffer floated upon the waves, drifting through the chaos of the world. The waters rose higher, swallowing mountains, forests, and cities, until there was nothing left but water and sky. The world had become a sea, and the flood seemed endless. Inside the coffer, Deucalion and Pyrrha clung to one another, their faith in the gods, in their own survival, the only thing that kept them afloat. The world outside was a maelstrom, a chaos of destruction, but they remained steadfast, their resolve unbroken. When at last the storm ceased and the waters began to recede, the coffer came to rest upon Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and Pyrrha stepped from the coffer, their feet touching the solid earth once more. The world around them was silent, the air heavy with the scent of rain and earth. The destruction was complete. The flood had taken all but the two of them. Zeus, in his mercy, spoke to them from the heavens. "You are the survivors, the last of your kind," he said. "The earth has been cleansed. It is yours to repopulate, to rebuild." And so, at Zeus's command, Deucalion and Pyrrha sought to repopulate the earth. They stood together side by side, and with a solemn prayer, they threw behind them the bones of the earth. As they did, the stones turned to flesh, and from them sprang the new generation of mankind. The world was reborn from the ashes of the flood. The memory of the destruction was etched into the very bones of the earth, and in time the people of Greece would remember the flood and the gods that had wrought it. They would honor the legacy of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the first of their kind, who had brought forth life from the stones of the earth. And in the city of Athens, a strange ceremony was held each year in memory of the great flood. The hydrophoria, a ritual of mourning, was observed to honor the souls lost in the waters. Water was poured into a crack in the earth, a symbol of the deluge, and flour mixed with honey was offered as a sacrifice to appease the spirits of the dead. This ritual, with its echoes of ancient rites from the distant lands of Syria and Phoenicia, reminded the Athenians of the flood's power, of the divine wrath that had once consumed the world, and of the ever-present memory of the waters that had washed away all that was before, and thus the legends of Ogyges and Deucalion intertwine, their stories becoming the foundation of myth in ancient Greece. 2 kings, 2 survivors, 2 tales of divine wrath and salvation. And in the heart of each story lay the same truth, that the gods held the power to destroy and to save, to create and to cleanse. And mankind, caught in the balance, would forever be shaped by the waves of fate that they had set in motion. The echoes of Atlantis, the Bronze Age flood, the ancient lands of Greece stood beneath a darkened sky, the horizon smothered by an unnatural gloom. The gods, whose every step shaped the world, had woven their plans into the threads of fate, and their wrath would soon be upon the earth. Zeus, the king of the gods, stood high on Mount Olympus, his gaze sweeping over the lands he had once blessed. The earth had turned vile. The men of the age of bronze, those great metallurgists who had wielded the power of fire and metal, had grown corrupt, their hearts filled with greed and violence. The world had become unrecognizable, a place of suffering and ruin. It was time, Zeus knew, to cleanse the earth, to wipe away the stain of mankind's sins. The flood would come. Far below, in the plains of Thessaly, Deucalion, son of Prometheus, stood with his wife Pyrrha beneath the heavy skies. The clouds had gathered without warning, thick and oppressive, as if the heavens themselves were mourning what was to come. Deucalion's father, the Titan Prometheus, had warned him of the impending cataclysm, and now the prophecy of the gods was about to unfold. "Zeus is angry," Deucalion said, his voice low but filled with an unshakable resolve. "The world is to be cleansed." Pyrrha, standing beside him, shivered despite the warmth of the air. "What are we to do, my husband? How can we survive such a wrath?" Deucalion, his gaze steady, looked to the horizon where the first drops of rain began to fall. "We will build a coffer, a chest to float upon the waters, and we will survive. The gods have given us a chance. We will take it." And so, Deucalion set to work, crafting a vessel strong enough to endure the coming deluge. The coffer was made of the finest wood, sealed with pitch to protect it from the waters that would soon rise to devour the earth. As the storm clouds thickened overhead, the flood came closer, swift and unstoppable, as though the very earth was being torn apart. The rain began to fall in torrents, and the wind howled through the trees. Deucalion and Pyrrha climbed into the coffer, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had just begun. The waters rose quickly, rushing over the fields, swallowing the land whole. For 9 days and nights the coffer floated, tossed upon the waves. In those endless hours the world outside was a chaotic whirl of water and wind. Deucalion held on to Pyrrha, their hands entwined, finding solace only in each other's presence. There were no stars to guide them, no land to anchor their souls. The earth had become nothing more than an endless sea, and they, the last of humanity, were adrift in it. Elsewhere, in the land of Megara, the echoes of the gods' wrath were felt. The cry of cranes, loud and sorrowful, reached the ears of Megaros, the eponymous hero of the city. He was the son of Zeus and the nymph Cythnides, And though his name would become lost in the sands of time, his actions would be remembered for generations. As the floodwaters rose in the distance, Megaros felt the stirrings of the divine. The cry of the cranes, those ancient heralds of change, told him what he needed to know. The danger was real. With urgency, Megaros fled to Mount Geranian, seeking refuge in the high places where the waters could not reach. There, upon the mountain, he watched as the world around him was consumed by the storm. The flood came just as the gods had foretold, but Megaros, like so many others, would survive. Far to the north, in Thessalian lands, another hero faced the deluge. Cerambos, a man of mythic proportions, was said to have been granted wings by the nymphs of the land. These wings, imbued with the grace and power of the divine, lifted him from the earth and carried him above the rising floodwaters. While the world below drowned, Cerambos soared through the storm, his wings beating against the heavens, carrying him to safety. Further still, in the ancient city of Dodona, Zeus had once again intervened. Pererus, the son of Aeolus, had been warned by the gods of the coming disaster. In the sacred grove of Dodona, where the ancient oak trees whispered the will of Zeus, Pererus sought refuge. The floodwaters swept across the plains, but Pererus, like Megaros and Cerambos, would survive, shielded by the divine intervention of Zeus. In the island city of Ceos, the hero of the flood was Merops, the son of Hyas. Under his leadership, the survivors of the catastrophe gathered, and together they rebuilt what had been lost. Merops became a symbol of survival, of life in the face of the gods' wrath. His story would be passed down through the ages, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was hope. And in the distant land of Samothracia, the figure of Saon, either the son of Zeus or Hermes, became the figurehead of the survivors. It was said that he led the remnants of humanity to safety, guiding them through the storm and the flood until the earth could once again support life. In each of these lands, the name of Zeus, the great king of Atlantis, was revered. His influence, his power, seemed to stretch beyond the borders of the world, touching all who lived in its farthest corners. The myth spoke of many who had escaped the flood, who had found refuge on distant shores, or who had been saved through divine intervention. But there was something more, something deeper. These legends, these stories of survival, pointed to a far greater truth. They spoke of Atlantis, the lost empire that had once ruled over vast lands, its people masters of the earth, its kings and queens divine in their right. In the wake of the great flood, it was likely that these survivors, those who fled the rising waters, had sought refuge in distant lands. Perhaps they had already established colonies in places like Megara, Thessaly, Chios, and Samothracia. Their ships had crossed the seas long before the deluge, carrying with them the seeds of a lost civilization. They had been the great metallurgists of their age, their bronze implements and weapons scattered across Europe, their influence felt far and wide. It was clear then that the flood had not been the end of Atlantis, but merely a chapter in its story. The Atlanteans had survived, their legacy living on in the survivors of the flood, their influence shaping the future of mankind. As the storm receded and the earth slowly began to recover, the survivors of the deluge, whether led by Deucalion, Cerambos, or Merops, would rebuild. And in the telling of their stories, in the recounting of their survival, the name of Zeus, the king of Atlantis, would live on, echoing through the halls of time. The echoes of Atlantis, the lost empire. The city of Athens had always been a place of unparalleled splendor, a cradle of wisdom and beauty that echoed through time. But in the shadowed depths of its ancient history, long before its golden age, there had been stories whispered in the streets and passed down through the generations. Stories of a mighty empire that had once ruled the seas and the islands of the far-flung ocean, a realm so vast that its name was etched in the memories of gods and men alike. Atlantis! It was in the cool morning hours, when the sun barely kissed the peaks of the Acropolis, that an old man, his skin leathery from the winds of time, gathered a circle of eager listeners beneath the shade of the olive trees. He was a storyteller, a keeper of the ancient knowledge that had been passed down like a precious artifact from the days when the gods themselves had walked among men. "The invasion of the East," he began, his voice gruff but compelling, "is the key to understanding the legend of Atlantis." The children, their faces filled with wonder, leaned in, and even the older men, seasoned by years of war and peace, could not help but be drawn to the story. This tale was one that stirred something deep within their hearts, a recognition that their very existence was bound to something much older than they had ever imagined. Baldwin, the renowned scholar of their time, had said in his book Prehistoric Nations that the events surrounding the fall of Atlantis were woven into the fabric of their festivals. The grandest of all, the Panathenaic festival, was the one that honored Athena, the goddess of wisdom, of war, and of the city itself. It was said to have been founded by Eratosthenes, the ancient king of Athens, a ruler whose name was lost to the mists of time, but whose influence still echoed through the ceremonies. The old man paused, his eyes narrowing as he recalled the ancient records. He spoke of the processions that had once paraded through Athens during the Panathenaic festival, the greater of which carried a peplum, a sacred garment that depicted the great war with the giants, a battle in which the gods of Olympus emerged victorious. Yet in the lesser Panathenaic festival, a different peplum was carried, one that showed how the Athenians, guided by the wisdom and strength of Athena, had triumphed over the Atlantes. "The war with the Atlantis," the old man whispered, "was not just a battle for land or sea, but for the very soul of humanity." He could see the confused looks in the faces of his audience and smiled. "What I mean to say is this: the Athenians were not merely fighting to protect their city. They were fighting to preserve their connection to the gods, to ensure that the legacy of their ancestors and of Atlantis itself would not be erased from the world." In his mind, the old man saw the images of those long-forgotten battles, the great fleets of the Atlanteans, their ships like floating fortresses, carrying the might of a civilization that had once ruled over the islands of the Atlantic Ocean. The inhabitants of those lands, consecrated to the gods of the sea, Poseidon and Neptune, had once held sway over all. But in time, as the legends told, their pride and greed led to their downfall, a downfall that shook the very foundations of the earth. On the banks of the Athenian agora, the scholars and philosophers gathered around their texts, eager to discuss the truth behind the stories that had been passed down through the centuries. Among them was Bach, a respected historian whose writings had shed light on the connections between the Panathenaic festival and the fall of Atlantis. He had studied Plato's writings with great care, noting the importance of the Athenians' victory over the Atlanteans in the ancient texts. In his commentary on Plato, Boeck had pointed to the two great festivals that honored Athena, the greater and the lesser Panathenaic festivals. The greater festival, he explained, was a celebration of the divine victory of the gods over the giants, a mythic war that had echoed throughout the ages. But the lesser festival, the one that the Athenians celebrated with even more fervor, was dedicated to their victory over Atlantis. "There are records," Boeck had written, "which tell us that the island of Atlantis was once the seat of a mighty civilization, whose power was unmatched by any of the ancient peoples of the earth. The Athenians, under the guidance of their goddess Athena, were the only ones who could stand against them." The old man nodded, his mind filled with images of those early days, when the city of Athens had stood as the last bastion of hope against the Atlanteans' imperial might. It was clear that the Athenians had not only fought for their own survival, but for the survival of the world itself. Baldwin's words echoed in the old man's thoughts. The Panathenaic festival, the most splendid of all Greek celebrations, was born out of the memory of the invasion of the East, which the legends tell us brought destruction to Atlantis. This, the old man believed, was the true origin of the festival. The great feast and procession held in honor of Athena were not just a display of gratitude to the goddess for her protection, but a remembrance of the battle that had saved humanity. The gods, through their divine intervention, had preserved the ancient knowledge of Atlantis, keeping its memory alive even as its ruins were swallowed by the sea. The old man's voice trembled with emotion as he spoke of the great fissures in the earth, the cracks in the land that had opened wide when Atlantis fell. He spoke of the lands beyond the Greek shores, of Hierapolis in Syria, where pilgrims had come to offer their sacrifices, pouring offerings into the cracks of the earth in an ancient ritual that had been passed down through the generations. "Can it be," he asked softly, his voice a mere whisper, "that these ceremonies, performed in places far removed from one another, are not simply the result of myth? Can we truly believe that these ancient rites were born of nothing?" He looked to his listeners, his gaze piercing. "I believe they are the echoes of an ancient truth, a truth that speaks to the heart of the human experience. The fall of Atlantis was not an event confined to myth. It was a historical reality, one that has shaped the world in ways we may never fully understand." As the last rays of sunlight fell upon the city of Athens, the old man's words lingered in the air, carried on the winds that swept through the olive groves. The people of Athens, whether they realized it or not, were living in the shadow of a great past, one that connected them to a civilization long lost to the tides of time. The old man smiled faintly, knowing that the stories of Atlantis would never truly fade, that the gods' influence would continue to shape the fate of mankind for generations to come. The echoes of the Atlanteans, their great empire, and their final battle against the gods would forever resonate in the hearts of those who remembered. And thus, in the quiet moments before the stars appeared above Athens, the story of Atlantis lived on, eternal, in the memory of the people who had inherited its legacy. The waters of memory. In the dim light of a crackling fire, an elder sat with a group of curious listeners gathered around him, the warmth of the flames flickering across their faces. The evening air was cool, and the shadows of the surrounding trees stretched long over the grass, but the circle was drawn tight, the stories of old beckoning those who could still listen with open hearts. "Now let me tell you of the waters," the elder began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of centuries. "It is too much to ask us to believe that the stories of the great flood, the deluge, are nothing but myths. When we speak of the ancient flood, we must ask ourselves, do we truly believe that these tales, passed down from generation to generation, are mere fabrications?" The wind rustled through the leaves, and for a moment there was a stillness, as though the earth itself awaited the words to come. "From the earliest scriptures, from the Babylonians to the Greeks, we find the story of the flood repeated," the elder continued, eyes narrowing slightly as he spoke. "The tale of Noah, the hero of the flood in the Bible, is not an isolated legend. Far from it. His voice grew richer with the weight of ancient knowledge as he recounted the diverse origins of the deluge myth. The people of the Isle of Chios, for instance, have their own version of the flood. There, the hero of the tale was Merops." The elder's eyes gleamed with recognition, a glint of understanding. "But here's where it becomes interesting. According to the historian Theopompus, one of the names of the Atlanteans was Merops." He paused, allowing the connection to settle like a stone sinking into still waters. The listeners exchanged glances, intrigued by the revelation. The elder, pleased with their curiosity, leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. "You see," he continued, "this name, Meropes, ties the people of Atlantis to the flood legends that span the globe." The flames crackled louder as though in agreement, casting long shadows across the gathered faces. "But we have not yet uncovered all the flood stories," the elder said, his tone now more somber. "The Magi of Persia held a tradition, one that speaks of the waters coming from an oven, of all men drowning, save for Noah and his family." A low murmur spread through the group. The elder's words were like the brushstrokes of a master painter, each new detail adding to the canvas of an ancient world. "In the Quran," he added, "the story is told again of the flood coming from an oven, of God commanding the earth to swallow its waters and the rain to cease. The similarity to the biblical account is undeniable, and yet this story existed long before the Prophet Muhammad's time. He stood then, pacing slowly around the fire, his voice growing in intensity as he spoke. All over the world these tales spread. In Wales, the bardic poems speak of a flood, one that occurred in the ancient land of Prydian or Britain. There, 3 great catastrophes struck: fire, drought, and the flood. The first of these, the eruption of Llyn Llywn, the Lake of Waves, drowned the entire country. Every soul except for Dwyfyn and Dwyfach, 2 survivors who saved themselves in a vessel without rigging, and it was they who repopulated the land. The elder's words fell like drops of water, each one splashing into the minds of those listening. The air seemed to grow heavier, filled with the weight of history. Some may say that the triads, the short, concise forms of these legends, are but recent creations, dating back only to the 13th or 14th centuries, but we must not dismiss them so easily. These legends have roots that stretch much deeper into the very soil of the ancient world. He looked out across the group, his gaze intense as he spoke of Pictet's observations. Pictet, the scholar, noted that although the triads were not ancient in form, they undoubtedly carried ancient traditions. They are not mere echoes of Genesis. They stand as independent indigenous memories of a time long past. The Cymry, the Welsh people, had their own flood tale, their own connection to the waters that swept across the earth. The elder paused again, turning to look at the fire, his reflection dancing in the flames. "But there is more," he murmured, almost to himself. In these tales, the name of the vessel, Nefidnuf Nejon, is of particular note. In this triad, it is said that this vessel carried a pair of all living creatures, much like the Ark of Noah. The name itself, Nefidnuf Nejon. Perhaps it was formed in imitation of the patriarch Noah's name. It is a curious thing, is it not? His voice softened, and he sat once more, drawing the circle closer. We also hear of the horned oxen of Hu the Mighty, who drew the Avanc, a creature that may have been a beaver or a crocodile, out of the floodwaters. These enigmatic elements, these stories, may be confusing, but they are part of the same pattern. The Cymry, the Welsh, carry with them their own indigenous memory of the deluge. The wind whispered through the trees, and the flames flickered once more, as though the very air listened in on the elder's words. "You must understand," he said, looking into the eyes of his listeners with a grave intensity, "that we are not merely talking of legends. These stories, these floods, were real in the hearts of those who told them, whether it is the flood of the Magi, or the flood of the Cymry, or the flood of the Greeks. They are all echoes of something much greater, a memory of the earth, reshaped and renewed by the great waters." A moment of silence followed, thick with the weight of the elder's words. The fire crackled and popped, the night pressing in around them, and for a moment it felt as though the stories of the ancient world were alive again, swirling around the flames, reaching out to touch the present. The elder leaned back, his voice barely a whisper now. "We must not be so quick to dismiss the past, for in these stories we find a common thread that binds us all, a reminder that the waters of time have shaped us just as they once shaped the earth." And as the fire flickered out, the night settled around them, leaving behind only the echo of the elder's words, reverberating through the ages like the distant rumblings of a flood that had swept across the world, and left its mark on the hearts of all who lived to remember it. The secrets of the waters. The fire crackled and hissed as the dark night pressed close around the small group of travelers gathered by the edge of the river. They sat in the shadows, the faint glow of the embers casting long, dancing shadows on their faces. A steady breeze whispered through the trees, but the air was thick with anticipation, as though the earth itself held its breath. Eldrick, an old man whose eyes had seen the turning of countless seasons, leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His voice, low and rich with the weight of centuries, reached out to the group. "There is a tale, a thread that runs through the heart of the world, a tale of water, of floods, of the shaping of the earth. It is not confined to one people, one land, or one era. It echoes through the ages, across continents, in stories that have been passed down as if carried on the very currents of time. The fire flickered, throwing shadows onto the faces of his listeners. The air grew colder as the night deepened, yet the warmth of the fire seemed to draw them in, their attention fixed on Eldrick's every word. "You know," Eldrick continued, his eyes glimmering in the firelight, "the tradition of the flood is not a singular thing. It is not confined to one culture, one race. It weaves its way through the myths of the old world, leaving its mark in places far and wide." He paused, his gaze drifting to the dark waters of the river beside them. "Take, for instance, the Edda, the great compendium of Nordic lore. In the Scandinavian tales, we find something strikingly similar to the flood legends of the East. It is a tale of giants, of gods and destruction, of water pouring from the veins of the earth itself." The group leaned in closer as Eldrick spoke of the ancient myth of Ymir, the father of the Jotun, the ice giants, who was slain by the gods Althene, Wili, and we, the sons of Boit. His body, torn apart by the power of those gods, was used to shape the world. From his blood, rivers and oceans flowed, drowning the giants in its torrent. But one, a lone survivor named Bergelmir, managed to escape, his wife by his side, taking refuge in a boat. From them, the giants were reborn. Eldrick's voice softened as he recalled the dark, ominous words of the Vala's prophecy from the Edda. There is a line in that prophecy that captures the essence of the flood. The sun darkens, the earth sinks into the ocean, and the stars fall from heaven. Do you see it? It is a vision of the world consumed by water, the very fabric of creation torn apart, drowning in the chaos of the elements. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the river with it, and for a brief moment the group seemed to hear the roar of the waters in their minds. Eldrick's words hung in the air like an incantation, ancient and filled with a haunting reverence. "The tradition of the deluge is not limited to the Nordic myths," he continued, his voice gaining strength as the fire crackled behind him. "In the East, in the land of the Egyptians, the story takes on a different shape. The Egyptians themselves, despite their many grand legends, do not have a universal flood myth like the one told in Genesis. You might wonder why." He paused, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. "The answer is simple yet profound. The Egyptians, unlike the Greeks or the Hebrews, did not tell stories of a world-wrapping flood. They had, however, preserved the memory of the destruction of Atlantis, a great catastrophe that was much more localized. They did not need a myth of a flood that covered the entire earth, because they had a memory of a flood that swallowed only a part of it, the land of Atlantis." The firelight flickered, casting a warm glow on the faces of the listeners, their eyes wide with the weight of the revelations. "You see," Eldrick continued, "the Greeks, when they spoke to the Egyptian priests of their own flood myth, were told that Egypt had been spared. The Egyptians did not share the same reverence for the deluge as the Greeks or the Hebrews. They had no Ararat, no great mountain to stand atop when the waters receded. And what they knew, what they preserved, was a true history of Atlantis." He leaned forward slightly, the firelight gleaming in his eyes. "You must understand, the Egyptians were silent on the matter of the deluge because they knew of a different catastrophe. They had no need for myths about a universal flood, because their history carried the memory of a far more specific, more devastating event, the sinking of Atlantis. That was their great flood, the one that shaped the very fabric of their civilization." A hush fell over the group. The river seemed to flow more quietly now, as if listening to the weight of Eldrick's words. The night stretched on, and the fire crackled with a gentle rhythm, like the heartbeat of the world. Eldrick sat back, his expression thoughtful. "Now there is another figure, Cosmos, a monk from 1,000 years ago. He wrote a book called Topographia Christiana, a work that includes a map of the world as it was understood in his time. Cosmos believed that the earth rested upon water, surrounded by an ocean. Beyond that ocean, he claimed, lay the land where men lived before the deluge. This land, according to Cosmos, was none other than Atlantis itself. The group sat in stunned silence, the enormity of Eldrick's words sinking into them like stones cast into a deep, still lake. Cosmos's map, he added, is a curious thing. It shows the world before the flood, a world that existed before the waters came to change everything. And when the waters receded, what was left? What became of the people who lived in that land? Eldrick's gaze lingered on the flames as he spoke softly, almost to himself. Perhaps they were the ancestors of the Greeks, of the Egyptians. Perhaps they passed their knowledge down through the ages, leaving traces of their civilization in the myths and stories of the world. The fire crackled and popped, and the soft sound of the river's flow seemed to mingle with Eldrick's words, weaving the fabric of the world's ancient memory around the travelers. They sat wrapped in the story as the night deepened, and the stars above them began to gleam with a distant cold light, silent witnesses to the waters that had shaped the world they now knew. And as the fire began to die, leaving only embers and the quiet murmur of the river, the travelers could not help but wonder how many of the old tales, the flood stories of old, were more than just myths. How many of them were the echoes of a time long past, when the waters rose and reshaped the earth itself. The map of Cosmos. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, the smoke curling upward in lazy tendrils as the fire crackled and popped in the hearth. A small group sat huddled together in the dim light, their faces softened by the flickering flames and their minds focused on the old man at the center of the room. His voice, deep and gravelly from years of use, spoke not only of the present but of a distant past, a time when the earth itself was viewed through the eyes of those who tried to make sense of the vast unknown world. His name was Brother Elias, an aged monk whose life had been spent in quiet contemplation and the study of forgotten texts. Now, his hair was thin and white, and his once firm hands shook slightly as he turned the pages of a weathered manuscript before him. He paused, his eyes scanning the words before looking up at the eager faces around him. "There is a map," he began slowly, "a map unlike any we've seen, drawn not for the lands we know, but for the world as it was understood 1,000 years ago. It was created by a monk named Cosmos, a man who sought to bridge the gap between the known and the unknown, a man who viewed the earth not as a static place but as something dynamic. Suspended between heaven and the waters below." The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the stone walls as Elias's voice grew more animated, drawing his listeners closer. Cosmos, you see, believed the earth to be a body surrounded by water, resting upon nothing. "The earth presses downward," he wrote, "but the igneous parts tend upward. And so, between these conflicting forces, the earth hung suspended, as though caught between two opposing elements." He leaned in slightly, his breath catching in the cold air. It is as if he had glimpsed the great mystery of the cosmos, the delicate balance of nature, the forces that shape the world, like Mohammed's coffin suspended in mid-air, neither falling nor rising. He saw the world as a fragile thing, held together by the forces of the universe. The monk paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in, and then he turned to the map that lay open before him. The parchment creased and faded with age. This map, drawn by Cosmos, shows a world vastly different from what we know today. He placed the lands we now inhabit within the boundaries of an ocean that surrounded the known world, stretching out into the unknown. Beyond that ocean, to the east, lay the land where, according to Cosmos, man was first created and where paradise itself was located. The fire crackled again, and the silence in the room deepened. The monk's voice softened as though he were speaking of something sacred, something that could never truly be understood. Cosmos believed that it was from this land, this paradise, that Noah and his sons were carried, after the deluge, to the earth we now inhabit. The 4 rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Pison, and the Gihon, he believed, gushed forth from the very heart of paradise as though they were the lifeblood of the earth itself. Elias's fingers traced the map, pointing to the illustration that depicted the Mediterranean Sea, the Arabian Gulf, and the Caspian Sea, each labeled carefully in the old script. "Here," he said, "you can see it, J, the land where men dwelt before the deluge, to the east the paradise, and to the west the place of the deluge. It was from this western land that Noah, and with him all the remnants of the old world, came across the seas to the shores of the Mediterranean. The room was silent as the listeners absorbed the words. In the stillness, the shadows seemed to stretch long and far, the fire casting its glow on the faces around the room, now solemn and reflective. Elias continued, his voice almost a whisper now. Cosmos's vision of the world was not just a map of physical lands. It was a reflection of the great events that shaped history. The deluge, in his eyes, was not an isolated event, but a marker of a great transformation. It pointed westward, where the old world, the world before the flood, had been. And it was from the west that the survivors came, bringing with them the seeds of civilization, of knowledge, and of a world reborn. The monk paused again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recalled the final part of Cosmos's work. And here, on the edge of the map, is something curious, a high mountain to the north, beyond which the sun hides itself at night. The sun, Cosmos believed, descended behind this mountain, giving rise to the cycles of day and night. It is as if the sun itself was caught in the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between creation and destruction. Elias's fingers traced the mountain on the map, a crooked shape, a jagged line stretching upward into the heavens. This mountain, he murmured, reminds me of the crooked mountain of Aztlan described by the Aztecs, the mountain of their ancestors. In their mythology, it is said that from this mountain the sun rises and sets, giving life to the world. And perhaps, he added thoughtfully, Cosmos in his own way was echoing these ancient truths, these memories of a world that existed before. The room grew quieter still as the travelers absorbed the meaning of the monk's words. The fire, now dimming, cast a soft glow on their faces, their expressions filled with wonder and reverence. Elias straightened, closing the manuscript with a gentle sigh. What Cosmos taught us, what he tried to show, was more than just a map of the world. It was a vision, a glimpse into the past, a past that may be long forgotten by most, but which lives on in these ancient maps, in the myths of the deluge, and in the echoes of civilizations lost to time. He looked up, meeting the eyes of each listener in turn. The world, as Cosmos saw it, was not fixed, not stable. It was a place of flux, of forces in balance, of creation and destruction entwined. The deluge was not just a flood, it was the turning of the world itself, the beginning of a new age. And perhaps, he said softly, that is why the echoes of Atlantis and the lands before the flood still resonate in our myths, in our stories, and in the very fabric of our world. The fire flickered one last time, then settled into embers, leaving behind a silence that felt as though it carried the weight of centuries. The travelers sat in stillness, as if they had touched something ancient, something eternal, and the night stretched on, filled with the quiet understanding that the past, with all its secrets, was never truly gone. It lingered, hidden in the folds of the earth, in the stories we tell, and in the maps we draw of the world. The deluge legends of America, the deluge legends of America. The fires in the hearth crackled, sending a warm glow across the dimly lit room where the scholars and travelers had gathered. Outside, the wind howled, a reminder of the storms that could descend from the mountains. Inside, the only sound was the murmured conversation that seemed to pulse with the weight of ages. At the head of the gathering stood an older man, his silver hair falling in thin strands over a weathered face, his eyes sharp despite his years. He was known as Father Tomas, a scholar of ancient texts and the hidden histories of the Americas. His fingers danced over the faded pages of an old book, its leather cover cracked and worn, yet the words within held the power to illuminate forgotten truths. The stories of the flood, Father Tomas began, his voice low but steady, are not confined to the old world. They are not isolated to the lands of Mesopotamia or the pages of Genesis. No, these stories, these ancient myths of destruction and rebirth, reach across the oceans, carrying with them the echoes of a time when the world itself seemed to have crumbled. He paused, turning a page in the old book, as the flickering light cast shifting shadows on the walls. The assembled group leaned in closer, caught by the weight of his words. There is a remarkable fact, Father Tomas continued, that the flood legends of the Americas bear an uncanny resemblance to those of the Bible and the Chaldean accounts. Alfred Maury, a scholar of renown, noted the similarity, especially among the peoples of Mesoamerica. He wondered aloud, how could these traditions, so strikingly close to those of the Bible, have made their way to the New World? Was it through the migrations from Asia? The ancient pathways across the Aleutian Islands? He shook his head, his eyes gleaming with understanding. Maury couldn't explain it. No trace of these stories is found among the Mongol or Siberian peoples who would have passed through those lands. And certainly Buddhism, if it had made its way to the Americas, would not have carried such a myth within its teachings. Father Thomas smiled softly, a trace of mischief in his eyes. The explanation is far simpler than that. The flood legends didn't travel across the oceans through Asia nor through the Aleutian Islands. No, these legends are older, rooted not in distant lands but in the very soil of America itself. They were passed down through the generations, carried by the ancient peoples of the New World, who knew of a great land to the west, a land called Atlantis. He paused, allowing the thought to settle in before continuing. Atlantis was no mere myth, it was real. The civilizations of the Americas, from the highlands of Bolivia to the depths of Brazil, from the great riverways of the Mississippi to the mountains of Peru, were once colonies of Atlantis. These peoples shared a common language, a common culture, and a common history. They were, in essence, the children of Atlantis. The fire crackled once more, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Father Tomas leaned forward, his voice taking on a more intimate tone. That is why the flood myths of Mexico, for example, align so closely with those of the Bible and the Chaldean records. These traditions didn't arise from the same place as those of the Old World, but they were born from a shared history, a collective memory of a civilization that perished in a great cataclysm. He opened a book, revealing detailed sketches of ancient Mexican codices, faded symbols that seemed to breathe life under the flickering light. The most significant of these traditions, Father Tomas said, pointing to the illustrations, are the Mexican accounts. In these we find a story that mirrors the biblical tale in ways that cannot be mere coincidence. The hero of the Mexican flood is Coxcox, or Tisbe, as he is sometimes known. He, like Noah, saved himself and his family from the deluge, but he did not build an ark as Noah did. No, he sailed in a bark, or sometimes, according to some sources, a raft made from cypress wood. The group sat in rapt attention as Father Tomas's finger traced the image of the vessel on the page, a simple craft surrounded by turbulent waters. In some accounts, Tisbe's journey is one of survival, not just of his family, but of the world itself. With him he carried animals, representatives of all the species that would repopulate the earth and grain the seeds of the future. He paused, his gaze distant, as if he could see the scenes unfolding before him. When the waters began to recede, as decreed by the great god Tezcatlipoca, Tisbe sent a vulture out from the bark. The bird did not return, for it had fed on the carcasses of the drowned earth. Then Tisbe sent out other birds, each one returning empty-handed, until finally the hummingbird returned with a leafy branch in its beak. Father Tomas's voice grew softer, as if he were recounting a cherished memory. The hummingbird, the small and delicate creature, was the messenger of rebirth. It showed Tisbe that the earth was ready to bloom again, and so Tisbe and his family left the bark and ascended to the mountain of Coahuacan, where the world began anew. He closed the book gently, his eyes meeting those of his listeners. "This story," he said softly, "is not a mere fable. It is a memory of a time long past, a time when Atlantis fell and the world was reshaped by the waters." The Mexicans, like many other peoples of the Americas, carry within them the echoes of that cataclysm. They remember the great flood, not as a distant myth, but as a warning, a reminder of the fragility of civilization. Father Tomas's words lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of history. It is not by accident that the flood stories of the Americas so closely mirror those of the Old World. They were not borrowed from distant lands. They were born from the same source. The people of America, like the people of the old world, remember the fall of Atlantis and the great deluge that followed. The fire in the hearth flickered one last time, casting a final glow over the faces of the listeners. The silence that followed felt thick with understanding, as though they had touched something deep and eternal. The past, as Father Tomas had shown them, was not a forgotten story. It was a living memory, preserved in the legends of the flood, passed down through the centuries by those who had survived and those who had witnessed the world before the waters came. The Codex of the Deluge. The air in the small candlelit study of the monastery felt thick with anticipation, the weight of centuries pressing down on the young scholar seated across from Father Alvaro. The older man, a Dominican monk with graying hair and eyes that had seen more of the world than most, turned the fragile pages of an ancient manuscript. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the walls, giving the room an ethereal, almost timeless quality. Father Alvaro had spent most of his life in pursuit of the forgotten stories of the New World, and this document, now resting on the table between them, was one of the most significant discoveries in his research. It was the Codex Vaticanus, a treasure trove of ancient knowledge handed down through the centuries, carefully preserved in the Vatican Library. The Codex had been copied at Chobula from an earlier manuscript that predated the Spanish conquest, offering an invaluable glimpse into the indigenous traditions of Mesoamerica. "This," Father Alvaro murmured, tracing the symbols on the parchment, "is the heart of it, the cosmogony of the Mexicans, their understanding of the world and its destruction." His voice grew more animated as he spoke, passion radiating from him like a flame. The Codex Vaticanus describes 4 ages of the world, each one marked by a cataclysmic event. The first age was one of giants, great mammalia that ruled the earth, only to be destroyed by famine. The second age ended in fire, a terrible conflagration that ravaged the land. The third, well, it was the age of monkeys. Father Alvaro chuckled softly, a sound like wind through the trees, but his expression quickly shifted to one of solemnity. And then, the fourth age, Adonaiah, the son of water. This is where our story begins. The young scholar leaned forward, hanging on the older monk's every word. "The son of water," Father Alvaro repeated, "is the age in which a great inundation came, a deluge that swept away all of mankind. Only 2 survived, Cox and his wife Suchiquetzal. They were spared, floating upon the waters in a bark made of the trunk of a cypress tree. The goddess of waters, Matlalcuai, and her consort Tlaloc, the god of rain, are said to have witnessed their salvation." The monk paused, the candlelight dancing in his eyes as he scanned the codex, his finger tracing the delicate lines of ancient ink. In the picture, Cox and Xochiquetzal are shown floating, seated upon the tree trunk, adrift in the vast sea. Above them, the goddess Matlalcuai descends from the heavens, her form entwined with the rains, as though reaching out to claim the world. Father Alvaro's voice lowered, as if sharing a secret. "This flood," he said, "is not just a myth. It represents the final cataclysm, the last great destruction of the earth. The end of an age." The scholar nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "And this is where it connects with the story of Atlantis, isn't it? The idea that in a single day, all was lost." "Exactly," Father Alvaro said, his voice gaining strength. "In a single day, the mountains sank into the water. The land was swallowed whole. Even the very earth, the foundation of the world itself, was consumed." There was a long silence, broken only by the soft rustling of pages as the monk turned to another translation, this one from the Codex Chimalpopoca, another Aztec source that spoke of the flood. "The Aztec language gives us another layer to this story," Father Alvaro continued. "It says that the water was tranquil for 40 years plus 12, and then the sun, Nahui-Atel, water, came. The day of destruction was marked by a celestial event. In the tale, mankind was transformed into fish, their bodies submerged beneath the waters, except for 2, Nata and his wife Nena, who were forewarned by the god Titlacahuan." The young scholar scribbled notes furiously, his pen scratching against the parchment. "And the cypress tree, was it a symbol, like Noah's Ark?" Father Alvaro smiled, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student grasped the depth of the subject. Indeed. The cypress is sacred in many Mesoamerican traditions, often associated with rebirth and resurrection. In this story, it becomes a vessel of survival, just as the ark did in the Hebrew and Chaldean accounts. After the flood, Nod and Nana emerge, finding the world calm and filled with fish. The gods, however, are not pleased to see fire, the first human fire since the deluge. They question it, and Titlacahuan Tezcatlipoca descends to scold them. In his anger, he transforms the fish into dogs, creatures that will now roam the earth. Remarkable, the scholar whispered, his mind racing with the implications. It mirrors Plato's account of Atlantis, doesn't it? The idea that in one day the earth was consumed by water, the mountains sunk beneath the waves. Father Alvaro's face grew solemn, and he nodded gravely. Yes, Plato's description of Atlantis is a tragic echo of these legends. He speaks of mighty earthquakes and floods that engulfed a warlike people in a single day. The land disappeared just as the mountains vanished in the Aztec story. The parallels are unmistakable. The scholar looked up, a deep question in his eyes. Do you think it's possible that the Mexicans, like the Greeks, remembered something real, something from the past? A time when a great civilization vanished beneath the sea? Father Alvaro stared into the flickering flame of the candle, lost in thought. Perhaps. The ancient peoples of the Americas had their own stories of a lost world, of civilizations swallowed by water. The legends of Atlantis, of the deluge, are not just myths. They are warnings preserved in the very fabric of their culture. And whether they come from memory or prophecy, they share a common thread, the destruction of a great civilization by forces beyond their control. The scholar sat back, a chill running down his spine. The room seemed colder now, the shadows darker. The fire crackled, its warmth offering little comfort against the weight of the story they had unearthed. It was a tale of destruction, of civilizations lost to time, and of a warning that seemed as relevant today as it had thousands of years ago. As Father Alvaro closed the codex, his fingers lingering on the delicate pages, he spoke softly, almost to himself. The gods of the old world are still watching, still waiting for the day when the earth will change once more, when the waters will rise again and the world as we know it will be no more. The scholar nodded, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows across the walls as if the very room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to come. The son of water. The monastery was quiet except for the soft rustling of pages as Father Santiago flipped through the fragile manuscript laid before him. The thick smell of incense filled the air, and outside the window the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the stone floor. He sat in the dim light, his face illuminated by the flickering flame of a nearby candle. In his hands he held an ancient document, a translation of the Codex Chimalpopoca, the Aztec legend of the flood. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his spectacles, peering at the words written in a language both foreign and familiar. He had studied these texts for years, immersing himself in the mythology of the Americas, trying to decipher the stories of civilizations long past. Yet every time he came back to this particular passage, it felt as though he was touching the edge of something deeper, something far older than he could grasp. Across from him sat his apprentice, Esteban, who watched eagerly, his youthful face full of curiosity. The older monk sighed, knowing the weight of the tale he was about to share, a story that bridged worlds and time itself. The Aztecs, Father Santiago began, his voice slow, deliberate, believed that the world had already passed through several cycles, each one destroyed in a cataclysm that wiped away all life. He paused, glancing up at Esteban, whose eyes were wide, fixed on the parchment. This legend, the one that speaks of the flood, belongs to the Fourth Age. Father Santiago cleared his throat and began to read aloud, the translation from the Codex Chimalpopoca echoing in the stillness. This is the sun called Nahui Atel, water. Now the water was tranquil for 40 years plus 12, and men lived for the third and fourth times. When the sun Nahui Atel came, there had passed away 400 years, plus 2 ages, plus 76 years. Then all mankind was lost and drowned, and found themselves changed into fish. The sky came nearer the water. In a single day all was lost, and the day Nahuizojitl flower destroyed all our flesh. Father Santiago paused, his voice softening. Nahuatl, the son of water, came after long years of peace. But when it rose, it brought the destruction of everything. In one day, the world was lost, and the great flood claimed all of humanity. The people were transformed into fish, floating in the waters that swallowed their homes, their cities, and their lives. Esteban leaned in, his eyes reflecting the intensity of the tale. And then, he asked. The old monk smiled sadly, his fingers tracing the ancient ink. Then came a warning. The god Titlacahuan, a great and mighty god, foresaw the coming flood. He spoke to Nada and his wife Nina, instructing them to hollow out a great cypress tree. They were to carve a vessel from it, a place of refuge where they could survive the coming deluge. He turned the page, the parchment crackling softly in the silence. Titlacahuan told them to make no more wine from the agave plant, but to begin their work on the tree. And when the month of Tzantli arrived, when the waters began to rise and touch the sky, they were to enter the cypress vessel. The candlelight flickered, casting elongated shadows across the walls as Father Santiago continued, his voice quiet but filled with reverence. Then they entered in, and when the god had closed the door, he said, "Thou shalt eat but 1 ear of maize, and thy wife one also." But as soon as they had finished, they went out, and the water remained calm, for the wood no longer moved, and on opening it, they began to see fish. The monk leaned back, his eyes distant. Nada and Nina, the last survivors, ate only 1 ear of maize each, a symbol of sustenance and life amidst the destruction. They stepped out from their cypress refuge and saw that the waters had become calm. But as they looked around, they saw fish, life that had returned from the depths. Esteban sat quietly, processing the words. He could feel the weight of the story settling over him like the oppressive heat before a storm. What happened next? Father Santiago smiled faintly, his gaze turning to the heavens as if he could still see the gods watching over them. As Nada and Nena began to roast the fish they had found, the gods Sitla Linicu and Sitla Ladanak looked down from the heavens. They saw the smoke rising from the fire Nada had made and questioned what it was. To them, the smoke was a sign of human defiance. They were not yet sure what to make of it. He paused, waiting for Esteban to catch his breath before he continued. Titlacahuan, or Tezcatlipoca, descended to the earth in a fury. He chided Nada and Nena for the fire, for what they had dared to do in the wake of the flood. He saw the fish that had been transformed, the creatures of the sea now roasted and sizzling in the fire, and with an angry gesture, he transformed the fish into dogs. Esteban shuddered. Dogs? Yes, Father Santiago said, his voice filled with a somber respect for the tale's power. The fish, once a symbol of rebirth and survival, became dogs, creatures that would roam the earth for all time. They were changed as the world itself had been changed, and their transformation marked a new beginning for the world, though it was not without its price. The old monk closed the manuscript gently, his fingers lingering on the pages as if to feel the pulse of the ancient words. This story, like so many others, speaks to the fragility of life, to the capriciousness of the gods. And it echoes, Esteban, the ancient memories of a world that was lost to a great flood, a cataclysm that wiped away all that had come before. Esteban nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle deep into his soul. The flood, the transformation, the fire, it all felt like a warning, a reminder that even the most powerful civilizations could vanish in an instant, swallowed by the waters of time. Father Santiago rose from his seat, his movements slow, deliberate. We are like the fish in this story, Esteban. We float upon the waters of history, unaware of the flood that may come, the gods that may judge us. But the fire we create, the life we kindle will remain, transformed perhaps, but still burning. Esteban stood as well, his eyes locked on the older monk. And the dogs? He asked, his voice a whisper. The dogs are the future, Father Santiago said softly. the creatures that remain after the storm. They are both a reminder of what was lost and a symbol of what endures. In the end, the gods may change us, but we will survive in one form or another. The two stood in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire, the ancient stories reverberating through the centuries. The weight of the flood, the transformation, and the gods' judgment hung in the air like a distant storm. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the world, the cypress trees still whispered of the waters that had once risen, of the fire that had once burned, and of the dogs that still roamed the earth, watching, waiting. The sky above the land of the Aztecs hung heavy with a stillness that foretold the coming storm. For days the earth had trembled beneath their feet, each quake a whisper of what was to come, as though the gods themselves were shifting the world into place for a final reckoning. The gods who had once watched over the people with care were now silent. Their anger, like a brewing storm, was approaching, and no one could escape it. In the heart of the empire, nestled amidst the sprawling ruins and teeming markets of Tenochtitlan, old priests whispered ancient tales to those willing to listen. Tales of the gods' wrath, of the great flood that would sweep the earth clean, of men transformed into fish, and mountains sunk beneath the waves. The stories had been passed down from the elders, traced back through generations to a time when the world had been very different, before the sun Nahuatl, the son of water, had set its gaze upon them. The flood, as the Aztecs told it, was not a distant prophecy, but a memory. In a single day, the legend said, all was lost. As the heavens bent closer to the earth, the waters rose, swallowing everything in their path. The rivers ran wild, not as mere torrents, but as a mighty sea, consuming the land in one catastrophic rush. And in this flood no one was spared. The sun Nahuatl, the son of water, had come after 400 years, plus 2 ages, plus 76 years. The world, once filled with life, had reached the end of its cycle. The flood came swiftly, as though the sky itself had fallen. In a single day, all was lost, the priests would say, and those who survived, those who clung to the last vestiges of the world, had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Coxcox and Xochiquetzal, 2 human survivors, were the sole ones left unscathed by the deluge. They found themselves clinging to a cypress tree, floating amidst the waters as everything they knew sank beneath the waves. The sun had failed them, the world had ended, the earth had been drowned, and from the depths only silence remained. Their story echoed the tale of another, a story from a distant land across the great seas. It was told by the Greeks, passed down through the words of the philosopher Plato, who spoke of a mighty people who once ruled the earth but were consumed by their own hubris. Their cities, their vast temples, their mighty armies, everything was swallowed by the sea in the blink of an eye. Plato had written, in one day and one fatal night there came mighty earthquakes and inundations that engulfed that warlike people. The people of Atlantis, proud and strong, had vanished as quickly as they had risen. The similarities between the Aztec and Greek legends were undeniable. In the Aztec tale, even the mountains were not spared. The high peaks, which had once stood proud against the sky, were submerged in a single moment. The land of the living was erased, replaced by an ocean that stretched as far as the eye could see. Even the mountains sunk into the water, the Aztec priests would say. The world had been cleansed, and in its place only water and silence remained. This destruction, this cataclysm, was not merely an event, it was a transformation. The gods had not simply wiped the slate clean, they had reshaped the world, turning the once great civilizations into something else. The people who had once walked upon the earth were now fish, swimming in the waters that had swallowed their homes. And in the distant land of the Chaldeans, the legend of the flood took on a different form. The great goddess Ishtar wept for the lost souls, crying out, I am the mother who gave birth to men, and like the race of fishes, they are filling the sea. Her sorrow, deep and all-encompassing, resonated through the ages. The flood had not been a simple event of destruction. It had been a mourning, a lamentation for the loss of the world that once was. In Ishtar's cries, there was a deep, sorrowful recognition that the flood had been more than just the end of an era. It was a return to the beginning, a reshaping of all life. It was in these legends, in these stories passed down through the ages, that the shared truth of the ancient world could be found. From the distant lands of Greece to the sun-scorched plains of Mexico, the echoes of a lost civilization resonated. Atlantis, with its once proud people and its eventual destruction by the sea, was mirrored in the tales of the Aztecs and Chaldeans, their gods and their floods. In the end, the same fate awaited all: the rise of mighty civilizations, their inevitable fall, and the return of the earth to its primal state. The story of the flood, it seemed, was not one of mere catastrophe. It was a warning, a lesson about the fragility of all things. Whether told through the voice of Plato, the priest of Tenochtitlan, or the weeping goddess Ishtar, the message was the same. Nothing, no matter how grand, could escape the grasp of time, nor the power of the waters that would one day consume all. The storm came without warning. The skies, once clear and vast, darkened in an instant, as if the heavens themselves had been torn asunder. The earth, quiet and still for so long, began to tremble beneath the weight of an unseen force. A deep, rumbling sound reverberated through the ground, and the air grew thick with the scent of impending disaster. It was as though the very heart of the world was beating faster, preparing for some unspeakable event. In the heart of the ancient city, within the sacred grounds of the temple, an old priest named Tlaloc stood before the altar, his heart heavy with foreboding. The people gathered around him, their faces etched with fear, as the winds howled and the first drops of rain began to fall. The gods had warned them. They had foretold of this great flood, and now it was upon them. Tlaloc lifted his arms to the sky, his voice trembling as he spoke the sacred words that had been passed down through generations. "Great gods," he intoned, "hear our prayers. We offer you this sacrifice that we may find favor in your eyes, that the waters may recede and our people may be saved." The priests around him began their chants, their voices rising in unison as they prepared the altar. The smell of burning incense filled the air, mingling with the scent of rain as it grew heavier. Tlaloc placed a rare offering, a small sacred animal, upon the flames. As the fire crackled, a thick, resinous smoke began to rise, darkening the sky even further. The people watched, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and terror. As the smoke swirled into the sky, something strange happened. The heavens above seemed to respond. The clouds parted briefly, revealing a flash of lightning, and in that moment Tlaloc felt a shiver run down his spine. It was as though the gods themselves were watching, waiting for something. And then, with a suddenness that left no time for preparation, the ground began to shake. The earth trembled violently, and a low, thunderous roar echoed through the air. Tlaloc's heart pounded in his chest as the sky grew darker still, and the wind whipped around them in violent gusts. The waters had come, the great flood was upon them. Above, the gods looked down upon their creation with a mixture of wrath and pity. In the celestial realm, the great god Huracan, the heart of heaven, watched as the waters rose, swirling with divine power. His will had been done, and now the earth would pay the price. Tlaloc knelt before the altar, his eyes wide with fear. The floodwaters rose quickly, rushing through the streets, flooding the city. The people screamed in terror as they ran, pushing past each other in a frantic bid for safety. They sought refuge in their homes, but the houses were not strong enough to withstand the torrent. The roofs collapsed beneath the weight of the water, and the walls crumbled into the depths. "To the trees! To the trees!" Someone cried, but the trees too were no sanctuary. They shook violently, their roots tearing from the earth as the water surged around them. Those who tried to climb were cast down by the force of the flood. "To the caves!" another voice shouted, but the caves, those sacred places of refuge, closed themselves as if by divine command. The people were trapped, their cries swallowed by the roar of the waters. the earth itself convulsing under the strain. In the chaos, Tlaloc could hear the sounds of his people, of men and women, children and elders screaming in desperation. "The sky is falling," one cried. "The water is rising," another shouted. "Where will we go?" The noise was deafening, the sound of a world coming to an end. The scene was one of utter chaos, and yet, amidst the madness, there was a strange serenity. Tlaloc's mind raced, his thoughts a whirl of memories and stories passed down through the ages. This was the great cataclysm, the flood that had been foretold since the dawn of time. In the chaos he saw the reflection of the ancient legends, the flood of Noah, the deluge that had swept across the world in a single day. In the Genesis account, Noah had built an altar to the Lord, offering burnt sacrifices, hoping to appease the divine wrath. And then, after the waters had receded, the Lord had promised never again to curse the ground for mankind's sake. In the Chaldean legend, Khasisatra had done the same, offering sacrifices to the gods, while Bel, the angry god, prepared to finish what the flood had started. Yet in that moment, the great god Ea had intervened, saving the remnants of humanity from total annihilation. Tlaloc's mind drifted further to the ancient teachings where the hero of the Aztec deluge, Nata, bore a striking resemblance to Noah. The names were not identical, but close enough to be significant. Nata, with the broad A sound, was a name that, in the ancient tongues, resonated with water, just as Noah did in the Semitic languages. Both names carried the weight of the flood within them, the great cycle of destruction and rebirth. In the sacred texts of the Central Americans, the Popol Vuh, a similar scene played out, men running in panic, pushing each other in their desperation, while the water and fire ravaged the earth. The world, once firm and solid, had become a place of chaos and destruction. The descriptions, though different, carried the same dreadful echoes: the black clouds, the earth trembling, the roar of the elements. It was as though all the flood legends of the ancient world had converged on this single moment in time, as if the divine forces that shaped the world were now coming to collect what was owed. And as the waters rose, as the world around him was consumed by the flood, Tlaloc could not help but think of the words spoken in the sacred texts, words that had been passed down through the ages, through the generations. The world had been destroyed once before, and it had been reborn. And now, as he watched the earth being cleansed by the waters, he knew that the cycle would repeat itself. The flood, the great deluge, was not an isolated event. It was a warning, a reminder that no civilization, no matter how mighty, could stand forever. And as the flood waters raged on, Tlaloc could only wonder what would remain when the waters finally receded. Would there be anything left to rebuild? Would the gods smile upon them, or would they turn their gaze elsewhere? As the flood engulfed the city, Tlaloc whispered a prayer. "May the gods have mercy upon us," he murmured. "May we find favor in their eyes." But even as he spoke, the water rose higher, and the world he knew was swallowed by the depths. The village was quiet under the pale light of dawn, the morning mist rising from the fields, a soft veil between the earth and the heavens. But this peace would not last. A tremor, slight at first, shook the ground beneath the feet of the villagers. At first it was dismissed as nothing more than the aftershock of an old dream, but soon the tremors grew more insistent, more frequent. The air began to hum with an electric charge, thick and oppressive. A strange, almost unnatural stillness filled the air, as though the world itself was holding its breath. And then, as if on cue, the skies turned. The great heart of heaven, Huracan, had stirred. With his command, the waters began to churn. At first the ripples were small, just a soft lapping of the water against the earth's edge, but then the surface began to roil. The surface of the river that had always been calm, almost serene, was now a frenzy of crashing waves. The waters were agitated, a divine fury pushing them to the shores with unstoppable force. The villagers looked up in horror, their hearts gripped with dread. It was as though the heavens themselves had been torn open. A great resinous thickness descended from the sky, coating the earth in a thick, oily mist. The very air became heavy, as though the world was suffocating, and then it began to rain. At first, the rain was gentle, almost comforting, but as the minutes passed, it grew heavier, darker, more oppressive. The sky had turned black, and the water, now thick with the force of the storm, pounded down on the earth. Rain by day, rain by night, it came in unrelenting sheets. The villagers could only watch in horror as their world was swallowed by the tempest. From the high hills, the great river that had always been a source of life had become a roaring beast, an unstoppable flood that tore through the valley. The villagers ran. There was nothing else to do. Desperation filled the air like smoke, thick and choking. Men and women, children and elders were all in the same frenzied panic. The ground was shaking, and the noise above them, loud and fierce, was like the crackling of a fire, an immense roar that seemed to come from the heavens themselves. The sky, the land, and the sea had all conspired to destroy them. "To the houses!" someone shouted, but as they rushed toward their homes, the buildings began to collapse. The earth itself seemed to buckle and twist beneath the weight of the waters. The houses, those sturdy shelters, those places of refuge, crumbled as the flood surged forward, the foundations no match for the relentless force of the water. "To the trees!" another voice cried, but the trees, too, would offer no sanctuary. The great trunks swayed, groaning as if in pain, and when the people tried to climb them, the branches tore free, flinging them down into the rising waters. The trees, once symbols of strength, had become instruments of destruction, shedding their own burdens to join the great flood. "Into the caves!" Yet another voice shouted, but even that place of refuge proved treacherous. The caves, those sacred, hidden places where the people had once sought shelter from storms, closed themselves before the desperate souls could reach them. It was as though the earth itself had turned against them, and no place would offer safety. The sound of panic filled the air as people screamed and pushed their way through the chaotic landscape. The water was rising, swallowing the earth beneath them, and with it came a great darkness. It wasn't just a storm that brought the shadow. It was as if the very soul of the world was being consumed by the flood. And through it all, the words of the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Central Americans, echoed in the minds of those who had heard the legends. Water and fire contributed to the universal ruin at the time of the last great cataclysm which preceded the fourth creation. In the flood's wake, the remnants of a once thriving civilization would be nothing but a memory, lost to the abyss. For the villagers, it was the end of everything they had known. The heavens above had been torn open, and the earth below had turned against them. The great destruction was not only a force of nature, it was a culmination of a divine will, a cataclysm that had been foretold by the gods themselves. And yet, even as the floodwaters surged, even as the winds howled and the earth shook, there was a strange sense of inevitability. For the villagers, as for the people of the Chaldean legend, this was not merely a disaster, it was part of a cycle, a reckoning that would one day give way to something new. But in that moment, as they looked to the heavens and saw nothing but storm and darkness, it was impossible to imagine that anything could survive this great deluge. As the floodwaters rose higher and higher, sweeping away the last vestiges of their world, the villagers could do nothing but hold on. The world was dying, and in its death they too would be reborn, or so the legends had promised. But for now, all they could do was struggle against the water, to fight for their lives as the winds howled and the dark rains fell. Their world was ending, and they had no choice but to face it. They were caught in the middle of the last great cataclysm, the final battle between water, fire, and the gods. The day began with an unassuming stillness, the sun just beginning to crawl over the horizon, casting a faint golden light across the land. It was a moment of peace, but it wouldn't last. The earth beneath the villagers' feet began to tremble, a low rumble that grew steadily louder, like the growl of a great beast stirring in its lair. At first, the people thought it was merely an aftershock from the previous night's storm, but then the shaking grew violent, and a dark, menacing cloud began to churn in the sky above them. This was no ordinary storm. The wind picked up, fierce and howling, tearing at the branches of the trees and sending dust swirling through the air. The cloud that had appeared so suddenly above them was a black, suffocating mass, unlike any they had seen before. It seemed to grow darker with each passing moment, a swirling vortex of chaos. The smell of ozone, heavy and sharp, filled their nostrils as the sky darkened to an unnatural hue. The ground beneath them began to crack, deep fissures spreading wide like the earth was being torn apart. It wasn't just the wind or the rain. They could hear the sound of something more ominous, something more primal, emanating from the depths of the earth itself. A deep rumbling roar that seemed to come from the very core of the world. The trees began to sway violently, their trunks groaning under the strain, their roots cracking free from the soil as though the earth itself was giving way. "Run!" someone screamed, though the words were lost beneath the deafening noise. People dashed in every direction, their hearts pounding in their chests as they fought to escape the impending catastrophe. The rains began to fall, not in a soft, gentle shower, but in torrents. The water poured down in sheets, drowning the land with incredible force. The villagers scrambled to find shelter, but no refuge seemed to offer safety. The flood waters rose faster and faster until they reached the tops of the houses, and soon the flood was over their heads. The earth that had been their home, their sanctuary, was now a merciless force of destruction. The people, now scrambling to survive, found that no escape was possible. The houses they had once built with care now crumbled before the flood, collapsing into the raging waters. The trees, which had once stood as symbols of strength and life, were now swaying and cracking, their branches breaking free like the very limbs of the earth. Those who tried to climb them were thrown down, helpless, into the rising flood waters. Despair filled the air. People ran in every direction, pushing and shoving, trying to save themselves, but it was impossible. The waters were too fast, the earth too unstable. Everywhere they turned, they were met with chaos. There was nowhere to go, no place that offered safety. And then, just as the flood began to subside, the ground shook again. The very mountains, which had once stood as eternal guardians of the land, were swallowed whole by the rising tide. The earth itself seemed to groan in agony as the waters surged higher and higher, drowning the land beneath them. It was as though the entire world had turned against them, as though the very heavens were conspiring to undo all that they had built. Among the chaos, a familiar name whispered through the minds of those who knew the ancient legends, the name of Huracan, the spirit of the abyss, the god of the storm. The words of the Popol Vuh echoed in their ears. Then the waters were agitated by the will of the heart of heaven, Huracan, and a great inundation came upon the heads of these creatures. It was said that Huracan, in his wrath, would cause the earth to quake, the skies to darken, and the waters to rise. This was not just a storm, it was a reckoning, a cataclysm sent by the gods themselves. The storm that had come upon them seemed to carry the weight of ancient knowledge, a knowledge passed down from a time long forgotten. It was a story that spanned continents, a story told by many cultures across the world. In the far-off lands of the Chaldeans, it was said that the gods had unleashed their wrath upon the earth, sending forth a great flood that drowned the land. The Assyrians spoke of a similar event, a flood that swept across the world, destroying all in its path. The Bible, too, told of a great deluge, where the waters rose 15 cubits upward to submerge the earth. And now, here in this place, the same story was unfolding before their very eyes. It was as though the world itself was telling them the same tale, repeated over and over again from one civilization to the next. The name Huracan, the god of the abyss, the hurricane, the spirit of the storm, carried with it a deep meaning. It was said that this god was the very embodiment of the storm, the tempest that ravaged the earth. The word itself, with its roots stretching back through the languages of the world, suggested an ancient connection between peoples separated by vast oceans and centuries. In the language of the Aztecs, Huracan was a god of unimaginable power, whose storms brought destruction, but also a strange form of rebirth. The similarities between the tales of the flood were impossible to ignore. Whether in the lands of the Chaldeans or the Americas, the legends told of the same cataclysmic event, the same rising waters, the same despair, the same destruction of civilizations. The gods had come, and the earth had been submerged beneath the waves. The people of the village, like the ancient survivors of the Toltec legend, would be left to rebuild. And though they would survive, they would carry the memory of this flood with them, as did the Toltecs in their history. They would live in caves, they would wander for years, and they would pass down the story of their survival to future generations. But the flood had come, and it had changed everything. In the Toltec legend, it was said that the survivors of the flood had built a Toplepetlocali, a close chest, a place of refuge, a tower of safety. In the wake of this disaster, it was clear that the people would need to find their own way to survive. They would need to rebuild their homes, their lives, and their understanding of the world. But above all, they would need to remember the flood that had come from the will of the gods, the flood that had submerged the world beneath the waters, the flood that had wiped away everything they had known and from which they would rise again. The sky was darkening as the storm raged across the land. The villagers, caught in the maelstrom, were scrambling to survive as the rising water swallowed everything in their path. As they fought against the flood, the weight of ancient memories seemed to come rushing back with the same force as the waters themselves. It was as though the very earth was reliving a tragedy from ages past, one that had been told in countless myths and legends, passed down through generations spanning continents and civilizations. The flood that consumed them was not new. It was a familiar story, one that had been whispered in the winds of the ages. The villagers, now struggling to stay afloat, had heard the tale told in the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the ancient peoples of the Americas. The description of the great deluge, the rising waters, and the desperate flight for safety matched the stories from other parts of the world. And in the depths of the chaos, they felt the weight of this shared history, this shared trauma, connecting them to a lineage of survivors stretching across the earth. There was a striking parallel to be found in the Toltec legend. The waters, according to their ancient texts, rose 15 cubits, a number echoed in the Bible itself. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail. Genesis 7:20. It was as if the same flood, the same destruction, had been woven into the fabric of humanity's past, told in different tongues from different lands, yet still bearing the same mark of devastation. The image of the waters rising, overwhelming the earth was universal. It was a reminder of a time when the world had been undone by the very force of nature, a force that spared no one. In the records of the Aztecs preserved in the Boturini collection, there were depictions of their migrations, and in these ancient illustrations, their journey began on an island. The island, in one image, held a mountain, and in another, it was a high temple that stood in the midst of the land. The symbolism was clear. These people, the Aztecs, had not simply come from the earth. They came from a place of divine origin, from a land where mountains and temples intertwined. This was no ordinary origin. It was a memory of something far older, something more mysterious. The island they had fled, the boat they had sailed, the temple they had left behind, these were relics of an ancient place, a forgotten civilization, one that had once stood at the center of the world. Atlantis. The story of Atlantis was not confined to one culture, one civilization. It was a thread that wove through the tapestry of human history, appearing in the myths of the Aztecs, the Chibchas, and many others. For the Chibchas, the great divinity was Bochica, who had spent 2,000 years guiding his people to greater heights of civilization. His wife, Chia, was the moon, while Bochica himself embodied the sun. This duality, sun and moon, day and night, life and death, was a reflection of the cosmic balance that governed their world. But even Bochica, the god of light and order, could not escape the wrath of the deluge. When the storm sent by the god Chibchacum came crashing down upon the people of the tableland, it was a punishment, a judgment for some forgotten crime. But Bochica, ever the wise and compassionate deity, did not abandon his people. He rose to answer their prayers, appearing on a rainbow, a symbol of hope and renewal. The rainbow was not just a natural phenomenon in their eyes. It was a bridge between the heavens and the earth, a link between the divine and the mortal. Bochica, in his divine mercy, opened a breach in the earth at Tequendama, allowing the waters of the flood to escape. The earth groaned as it cracked open, and the flood waters poured out, receding back into the depths from which they had come. It was a scene that mirrored the stories from other parts of the world, the earth splitting, the waters receding, and the promise of renewal. This was the cleansing of the world, a purification that was both necessary and painful. But there was something more in the legend, something that transcended the flood itself. The god Chibchakum, who had brought the deluge upon the world, was punished for his anger. Like Atlas of ancient Greek myth, he was made to bear the weight of the earth upon his back, forced to carry the burden of the world for all eternity. The image of Chibchakum, hunched under the weight of the world, was a powerful symbol. It spoke of the unrelenting pressure of existence, the responsibility of creation, and the punishment of those who brought chaos into the world. The rainbow, too, was a reminder that all things were cyclical. After the storm, after the destruction, came renewal. The rainbow was a bridge between the old world and the new, a sign that the world would continue, that life would return, and that the mistakes of the past would be forgiven. But the burden of the flood, the weight of the water that had submerged the earth, was not easily forgotten. As the storm raged on, the villagers clung to these ancient memories, these ancient stories, trying to make sense of the disaster that had consumed them. They knew that they were not the first to face such a trial. The flood was a story as old as time, a story that had crossed oceans, transcended cultures, and been told in countless ways. It was a reminder that no matter where people lived, no matter their language or their gods, they all shared a history that bound them together. The flood was not just a force of nature, it was a reckoning. It was the story of the fall and the rise, the destruction and the rebirth. It was a story written in the stars, in the earth, in the very water that now threatened to drown them. And as they fought to survive, they knew that this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The storm seemed to rage with a mind of its own, as though the world itself had been pulled into a fury of primordial chaos. The sky, a swirling canvas of dark clouds, crackled with the raw energy of thunder. The wind howled in ferocious gusts, shaking the trees and sending waves of water crashing against the shores. The earth trembled as if it too could feel the weight of an ancient memory stirring beneath the surface. The villagers, their hearts heavy with a sense of impending doom, gathered near the high cliffs, the highest ground they could find, and looked out over the waters that were slowly creeping ever higher. In the midst of the pandemonium, an old man stepped forward, his voice rising above the storm. His eyes were sharp with the weight of knowledge, the knowledge that had been passed down through generations, wrapped in the folds of myth and history. He spoke with the calm of someone who had seen this before. This, he began, his voice low but steady, is not the first time the world has drowned. The others fell silent, their gazes fixed on him. They knew he spoke of more than just the storm. He was speaking of something older, something that had been told in their legends for as long as anyone could remember. You have heard the stories, he continued, of Bochica, the great god who rode the rainbow to save his people from the flood. You know how he opened the earth at Tequendama and let the waters flow away. But did you know, he paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the storm clouds seemed to swallow the sky, that these stories are not just myths, that they are memories, echoes of an ancient past? The young man, his face pale and stricken with fear, stepped forward. What do you mean? He asked, his voice trembling. The old man looked him in the eye, his expression somber. I mean that our ancestors, like the people of the Aztecs, came from a place that no longer exists, a place called Aztlan, or as some would call it, Atlantis. A ripple of unease passed through the group. The storm, howling ever louder, seemed to carry the weight of their ancestors' voices, urging them to remember. "You see," the old man said, his voice steady despite the growing tempest, "the Toltecs, the Aztecs, and even the Chibchas of Bogota, they all trace their origins back to this land, this island lost to time, Aztlan, the land of beauty and bounty, where civilization flourished for thousands of years. But like all great civilizations, it was destroyed. And in its wake, the flood came. The waters rose, drowning everything, just as they rise now." He looked out over the vast expanse of water, the horizon swallowed by the storm. "In their legends, the people speak of a great deluge, one that covered the earth. And just as in the Bible, they speak of waters rising 15 cubits, covering the mountains, drowning the world. The Toltecs, the Aztecs, the ancient people of this land, they all share the same story." The young man, his voice rising in disbelief, asked, "You mean to say that the great flood we are facing now, it is the same flood?" "Not the same," the old man replied, his tone heavy with wisdom, "but a repetition, a recurrence of the same ancient event, the same cosmic struggle, a reminder of what was lost. The flood we face now is not just a natural disaster, it is a symbol, a cycle. The Atlanteans, those who lived in Aztlan, knew this. They passed down their knowledge to the people who came after them. They carried with them not just stories, but the essence of civilization itself. Art, writing, knowledge, all of it came from that place, and it was the Atlanteans who taught the people of the Americas the ways of civilization. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. They had always known their land was ancient, but they had never fully understood its depth, its connection to a history that stretched back to a time before memory, to a place now lost beneath the waves. "How do you know all of this?" the young man asked, his voice barely a whisper. The old man smiled grimly. "I have seen the symbols. I have studied the images, the Aztec migration, the flood tablet on the calendar stone. They all tell the same story. The symbols are clear. A bird, a tree, a mountain rising out of the water. These are not mere pictures. They are fragments of a history that has been hidden in plain sight. The people of the East, the people who came from Aztlan, they did not come to the Americas by chance. They came because they carried with them the knowledge of the gods, the knowledge of how to survive the end of the world." The storm howled louder, as if the very winds were urging him to continue. The old man's voice grew softer, but no less powerful. "The Aztecs, too, speak of their migration from Aztlan. They were not driven by the need for a better land, but by something deeper. They were driven by a knowledge they could not escape, a knowledge of the deluge, the great flood that destroyed their ancestors. They were not simply looking for a new home. They were looking for a way to carry on, to preserve what had been lost." He paused, his gaze shifting to the young man standing before him. The Aztec name, Aztec, comes from Aztlan. It means those who came from Aztlan, and they carried with them not just their names, but their culture, their ways, their stories. And just as they did, so too must we must remember. For the flood is not just a disaster, it is a warning. The wind screamed in the distance, but in that moment the villagers stood still, a deep silence falling over them as they considered the weight of the old man's words. It was as if the storm had come to remind them of something far older than the world they knew, something that had been buried beneath the layers of time. The old man's voice broke the silence once more. "The legends are true. They speak of the flood, of the rainbow, of the breach in the earth where the waters flowed away. The rainbow is not just a sign of hope. It is a symbol of survival, of renewal. But we must not forget. We must not forget what happened before." As the storm raged on, the villagers huddled together, knowing that the past, with all its ancient wisdom, was not so far behind them. The flood was not just a force of nature. It was a story, a memory that bound them to their ancestors. And in the midst of the storm, they understood at last the flood they face now was but the latest chapter in a tale as old as time itself. The wind carried with it the whispers of an ancient past, a story long forgotten but never truly lost. The villagers gathered around the fire, their faces lit by the flickering flames, their eyes wide with curiosity as the old storyteller began his tale. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the heavy weight of the coming storm, but none of that seemed to matter. In this moment, there was only the story, the thread that connected them to a world far older than their own. "Listen well," the old man began, his voice low and steady, as if every word carried with it the weight of centuries. "The Popol Vuh, the sacred text of the Quiches, tells of a time long ago when a great migration from Aslan took place. It was a journey to the east, a journey undertaken by 3 sons of the king of the Quiches. Their father had passed, and with his death came the call to fulfill an ancient duty. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky, and the villagers leaned in closer, drawn into the tale. The brothers," the old man continued, "set out on the shores of the sea, the very sea from which their ancestors had come. They were following the instructions given by their father, a command to seek out the royalty, to find the land that would give them the power and knowledge they needed. And so they sailed across the waters, leaving behind their brothers and friends, promising to return once they had received what was rightfully theirs." The old man paused, his gaze distant, as if he could see the journey unfolding before him. The sound of the wind howled around them, but inside the circle of firelight there was a stillness, a sense of timelessness. "They arrived at the land across the sea," the old man said, his voice thick with reverence, "and there they met the Lord of the East. His name was Naxit, a great monarch, a being whose power knew no bounds. It was Naxit who granted them the insignia of royalty, the symbols that would mark them as rulers. But the gift was not just one of power, it was a gift of knowledge. They were given the art of painting from Toulon, a system of writing, things that would help them record their histories, to carry their legacy forward. The villagers exchanged glances, their minds racing to comprehend the full weight of the words. The return of these brothers," the old man continued, his voice now a whisper, "was not just the return of rulers, but of bearers of knowledge. They brought with them the tools of civilization itself, writing, art, and a system to record the past. They had gone to the East to receive these gifts, and in return they were changed. They returned not as simple men, but as those who had been touched by the divine, by the knowledge of a place that existed far beyond the reach of ordinary mortals." The fire crackled louder now, and the storm outside seemed to intensify, as though the very earth itself was responding to the weight of the story. "Where was Westland?" a young woman asked, her voice trembling with the gravity of what she had just heard. "This land where they received their knowledge?" The old man smiled, his eyes gleaming with the wisdom of ages. "It was the land of Aslan," he said, "the land that was not just a place but a symbol. Aslan was no ordinary land. It was a paradise, a land of great beauty, but it was also a place of great power, and it was the birthplace of the civilizations that would shape the Americas." A hush fell over the crowd, the weight of his words settling like dust in the air. "Aslan," the old man continued, "is what the Aztecs called their homeland. It was their origin, their beginning, their mythic place of power. But Aslan was not just a place in their stories, it was a land of knowledge, a place from which all the great civilizations of the Americas were born. Aslan, in its time, held dominion over the colonies that spread throughout Central America. It was a beacon of culture, a center of wisdom, and a source of the very things that would define the civilizations that followed." The villagers sat in rapt silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. This was not just a story, it was a link to something much larger, a story that stretched across time and space. "And what of this Naxit?" the young woman asked, her voice filled with awe. "Who was he?" "Naxit was more than just a ruler," the old man replied, his voice heavy with reverence. "He was a figure of immense power, a monarch whose reign stretched across not just the land of the East, but the hearts of the people who lived there. The gift he gave the brothers was not just a physical one, it was a spiritual gift, a blessing from the gods themselves. It was a sign of royalty, yes, but also a sign of the divine connection between the heavens and the earth. The storm raged on outside, but the group remained in trance, caught in the spell of the old man's words. "The legend," the old man said, his voice growing quieter, not only points to the East as a place of origin for these great races, but it also connects them to a much older tale, a tale of Atlantis. For Islam, the land of the Aztecs, was not just a place, it was Atlantis, the lost kingdom that existed long before the world knew of the Americas. The kings of Atlantis, as Plato tells us, ruled over parts of the great opposite continent. And so it was with the people of Aslan. They did not come to the Americas by chance. They came because they were destined to carry the knowledge of their ancestors, the knowledge of Atlantis itself. The fire flickered as the old man finished his tale, the flames casting long shadows on the walls of the small gathering. Outside, the storm began to subside, but the weight of the story lingered in the air. The villagers sat in silence, the depth of the old man's words settling into their hearts as they realized that their world was tied to a much larger tapestry, one woven with the threads of myth and history, a tapestry that stretched back to the lost land of Aslan and beyond. In the deep silence of the forest, a circle of elders sat around the flickering fire, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and the earthy scent of wet leaves. The stars above shone like scattered diamonds, yet there was a sense of something ancient, something that connected them all to a past far older than their own lives. The moonlight broke through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It was in this moment that the story of their ancestors was shared, as it had been for countless generations. "Listen closely," the elder began, his voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of years. "In the times before time, when our ancestors dwelt to the east toward the rising sun, there was a great warning. The father of the Indian tribes had a vision, a dream sent by the Great Spirit, that the earth would soon be covered by a great deluge, a flood that would swallow everything in its path." The fire crackled and popped, as though echoing the elder's words, and the group gathered closer, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. Heeding the warning, the elder continued, the Great Father built a raft, a vessel of salvation, and he took with him his family and all the animals. For months they floated on the waters, a sea that seemed endless. The animals, once capable of speech, complained loudly, cursed their fate as they drifted in the vastness. They, too, had their grievances, but their voices fell on the ears of the Father, who remained silent, determined in his task. There was a pause, and the group sat still, as if the weight of the words held them in place. But when the waters began to recede, the elder said, his voice growing softer, a new earth appeared, and with it the land was reborn. The father and his family landed, but the animals were forever changed. No longer could they speak. They had been punished, you see, for their complaints, for their murmurs against the one who had saved them. The elder let the silence linger, allowing the story to settle in the minds of the listeners, but one young man, his brow furrowed with curiosity, spoke up. "But what became of the animals? What happened to them after the flood?" The elder smiled, his eyes gleaming with ancient wisdom. "They became what you know them to be now, creatures of the earth with no voice. But their power, their connection to the divine was lost. The punishment was not only for their words, but for the very nature of their resistance to the Father, who had saved them from certain doom." The fire shifted, sending a rush of light across the circle, and another elder, a woman whose face was etched with lines of experience, added, "And it is not just our people who have such stories. In the lands to the north and west, there are other tribes, those who live near the great waters of the Mississippi. Their legends tell of a similar tale. They speak of a time when all of mankind was destroyed by a flood, and the good spirit had to change the animals into men to repopulate the earth." She paused, looking around the circle. "One such legend speaks of Menaboshu, the great hero who was saved from the flood. He sent a bird, a diver, out across the waters to check if the earth was drying, and in this way Menaboshu became the restorer of the human race, the one who founded society anew." The group nodded, recognizing the shared themes, the deluge, the rebirth, the recreation of humanity. It was a common thread that wound through the fabric of their histories, binding them together across distances, across cultures. One of the younger men, his voice filled with the wonder of discovery, asked, "But where did this flood come from? Was it truly a divine punishment, or was it something else?" The elder who had first spoken leaned forward, his gaze intense. That is a question many have asked, and it is one that we will continue to seek the answer to. But in the stories of the Great Lakes tribes, there is a recurring theme of a great father, an ancient leader who governed all the peoples, who was the ruler of the world, who lived toward the rising sun. And in his rule there were 12 sons, each charged with governing the earth. But those sons, as we know from the stories, became corrupt. They misused their power, became tyrants, and the world fell into chaos. The air seemed to grow colder as the elder spoke of the rebellion of the sons, of the loss of harmony and the rise of wickedness. It was the Great Spirit who saw this corruption and decided to intervene. It was the Great Spirit who allowed the introduction of spirituous liquors into the lands, who made the people drunk with their own power. And in their drunken state, they lost their divine gifts, and with that loss, the balance of power shifted. The white people, once subjects of the Great Father, rose up, usurping control. And from that moment, the tribe's heads were beneath their feet. A hushed murmur swept through the group. It was a story not only of a fall from grace, but of a rebellion, a shift in the order of the world. The Great Spirit, the elder continued, allowed this to happen because the sons of the Great Father had become too proud, too powerful. They had forgotten their place in the grand order of things. And when the flood came, it was both a punishment and a cleansing, a way for the earth to begin anew. The young man who had first spoken leaned forward, his voice filled with awe. So the flood was not just a natural disaster, but a divine retribution? Yes, the elder replied. And it is not just our people who have this story. The Delaware tribes, those who once lived along the Delaware River, speak of a similar tale. They tell of a time when the earth was covered by sea, a time when the first land, Netamaki, was destroyed. They say that the men became wicked, that the introduction of snake worship led to the fall of mankind. And then came the flood. The elder's voice softened. And after the flood, there was a separation, a division between those who were hunters and those who tilled the soil. The people spread out seeking new lands, and the snakes, too, fled to new places. Some say they went eastward to Snakeland. But for the Delawares, their journey continued, their path leading them through frozen lands and toward the cold, harsh regions where they would seek new beginnings. The group sat in silent reflection, the fire now dimming as the night deepened. They understood now that the flood was not just a single event in the past. It was a symbol, a story that echoed through their ancestors' lives, a tale of creation, destruction, and rebirth. And in this moment, as the winds whispered through the trees and the fire flickered low, they knew that their own journey was part of something far greater. A story that stretched back across time and space, from the lost land of Aslan to the waters of the Great Lakes and beyond. The wind howled through the forest, a sharp, biting gust that sent leaves tumbling in all directions. Beneath the shivering branches, a small group of elders gathered around a fire, its warm glow flickering against the dark canvas of the night. The air smelled of damp earth, the wetness of the forest floor mixing with the tang of wood smoke. Above, the stars pierced the sky like fragments of ice, cold and distant, yet ever watchful. The flames cast deep shadows on the faces of the listeners, each one a portrait of age and wisdom, carved by years in the stories they held. "Listen," the elder began, his voice rich and deep, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes gleaming with the weight of 1,000 years. "There was a time long ago when there was nothing but sea water upon the earth, no land, only the endless expanse of water, stretching out into the horizon. It was in this world of water that the sun, moon, stars, and earth were created. And with the earth, man was born." The group settled deeper into the circle, their faces rapt with attention, as if the story itself could breathe life into their very souls. The fire crackled, the embers leaping from the pit, illuminating the elder's face in sharp relief. "In that first age," he continued, his voice like the soft murmur of a river, "all were willingly pleased, all were easy thinking, and all were well happified. Life was simple. The people were free of worry, of pain. But this peace did not last long, for after a time a snake priest by the name of Poivako brought a dark gift to the people. Secretly he introduced the worship of Waken, the god of the snakes. The wind whispered through the trees, as if to carry the weight of the elders' words deeper into the night. The firelight danced on the elders' faces, drawing them into the past, where the winds carried the scent of earth and water. And with the worship of Wakan, the elder went on, his voice darker now, came wickedness, crime, unhappiness. The earth trembled, and the weather began to change. Storms grew more violent, distemper spread among the people, and death too began to walk among them. All this happened long ago in the first land, Netamaki, beyond the great ocean Kitahikau. A murmur ran through the group as the elder paused, letting the words sink in. The story had taken a turn into shadow, and the flickering flame seemed to hesitate, flickering low as if to acknowledge the change in mood. Then came the flood, the elder said softly, almost reverently. There was a powerful snake, Maskanako, a creature of great strength, and the people had become wicked, bad beings. Makoyoyui, the snake, seeing their wickedness, became their foe. The jinns, those who still held to the old ways, fought against the snake. But the battle was not a peaceful one. It was a battle of destruction, of chaos. The elder's hands moved slowly as he spoke, mimicking the movement of the floodwaters. His voice grew in intensity, swelling like the stormy seas of old. Maskanako brought with him the dark snake, the monster Amanyam, and the rushing waters of destruction. The waters came, rising higher, flowing faster, swallowing everything in their path. The earth trembled beneath the force of it. Hills were submerged, lands were penetrated by the flood, and everything was destroyed in its wake. The fire crackled again, the sound like a sigh from the earth itself, mourning the loss. Meanwhile, the elder said, his voice dropping to a whisper, at Tula, the great island, Nana Bush, the great hare, the old rabbit, became the ancestor of the new race. Nana Bush was born creeping, and he moved, ready to dwell on the island of Tula, and from there the beings and the men, all of them, crept from the flood, moving through shallow waters or swimming afloat. They asked, which way to the turtleback, Tulipin? But the way was perilous. Many monsters lurked in the depths, and some men were devoured by them. The fire leapt higher, casting long shadows that seemed to flicker like the monsters of the deep. But there was help, the elder continued, his voice softening. The daughter of a spirit appeared, a guide who helped them in a boat, Moko. She called to them, come, come, and they followed her, aided by her light, through the floodwaters. The group listened intently, the imagery of the boat guiding them through the darkness of the unknown, evoking a sense of both fear and hope. And when the waters began to recede, the elder said, the land began to dry. The people moved, traveling across the plains and the mountains, through paths of caves, and the power of motion carried them forward. They moved into new lands, seeking the sun, seeking a new beginning. The atmosphere around the fire grew tense, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the elder to finish. The air grew colder as the tale took on a new dimension. After the flood, the elder said, the world was different. The people, those who survived, moved into a cold country. It froze there. Snow fell and it was cold, it was harsh. So they moved on, seeking warmer lands, places where they could hunt cattle. And they divided into two groups, those who tilled the soil and those who hunted the wild. The good and the holy were the hunters, and they spread out, north, south, east, and west. The fire crackled as the elder paused again, his eyes reflecting the weight of centuries. Meanwhile, the snakes, those who had caused the fall, were afraid. They retreated into their huts, hiding from the anger of the people. The snake priest, Nakopawa, said to his people, let us go. And they went eastward to Snakeland, leaving the old world behind, and they went away, grieving. There was a somber silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the night. The fathers of the Delawares, those who were always boating and navigating, the elder continued, his tone now one of solemn reflection, found that the snake people had taken possession of a fine country. The Delawares gathered their people from all corners of the earth, north, south, east, and west, and tried to cross the waters of the frozen sea to claim that land. They traveled in the darkness of an Arctic winter until they reached a gap in the ice, a place where the sea was open. The fire burned low now, its glow casting the elders' faces in deep shadow, their expressions unreadable. They could go no farther, the elder said softly, his voice carrying the weight of resignation. Some of them stayed at Furland, while the others returned to where they had begun, the old Turtle Land. The wind howled louder as the tale wound to its close, and the group of elders sat in a hushed reverence, the tale of the flood and the dispersal of the people lingering in the air, heavy with meaning. The world had been remade, they understood. The great cycle of creation, destruction, and rebirth had turned again, and from the ashes of the old world, a new people had arisen, carrying with them the lessons of the past. Now, the elder said, his voice quiet but firm, we are the descendants of those who survived, those who carried the story forward. And we, too, must remember the lessons of the flood, the fall of man, the rise of the snakes, and the journey to find a new land. For the world, as we know, is always in flux, always changing, and it is up to us to navigate it, as our ancestors once did. The fire flickered one last time before dying down, and the night reclaimed its silence, wrapping the circle of elders in its cool embrace. The evening sky was a deep indigo, fading into the last streaks of a fiery sunset. The air, still warm with the day's heat, was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. In the center of the village, near the fire, a small group of Mandan elders gathered. They sat cross-legged in a loose circle, their faces solemn, marked with the weight of years and wisdom passed down through generations. Around them, the village seemed to breathe in harmony with their words. The faint murmur of children playing in the background, the soft rustle of wind through the trees, and the steady crackle of the fire created a soundtrack to their timeless ritual. The storyteller, an elder whose name had long since been forgotten by time but whose presence was felt in every word, began to speak. His voice was deep, resonant, drawing the listeners closer. The shadows cast by the firelight flickered across his face, lending an air of mystery to the tale he was about to share. There was a time, he began, his voice low and filled with reverence, when our ancestors lived not above the earth, but below it beneath the surface in the great darkness near a subterranean lake. It was a world unlike the one we know, a place where the light could not reach, where the sun did not touch. But from above, a vine stretched down, its roots reaching into our home. The fire crackled as the listeners leaned in, the intensity of the tale deepening the night around them. They had heard this legend before, but the elder's voice, full of weight and mystery, made it feel like the first time. This vine was a gift, the elder continued. It connected our world to the world above the surface, where the earth was rich with life. The first to climb it were the bold, the curious. They went up, and when they reached the surface, they saw the buffalo grazing, the land lush with fruits. The earth, as they had been told in stories, was a paradise. The elder paused, his eyes flicking across the faces of the listeners, each one caught in the sway of the ancient tale. Excited by what they had seen, they gathered fruits, grapes, and returned to their people below. The taste of the grapes was so sweet, so unlike anything they had known, that it was said the entire nation, all the men, women, and children, decided to ascend to the earth above. They climbed one by one, eager to leave the darkness for the light. A hush fell over the group, the only sound the distant call of a night bird. The storyteller's voice grew quieter, more solemn, as he reached the heart of the tale. But as they neared the surface, a heavy woman, one whose body could not bear the strain, climbed the vine, and in her ascent the vine broke, and with that the light was lost. The people below, who had already begun their journey up, were trapped. The vine, severed, closed the world above them, and the sun could no longer shine upon them. The weight of silence fell like a shroud over the group. The story, ancient and sorrowful, painted a picture of paradise lost, of an irrevocable separation from the world above. It is said, the elder continued, that this was no ordinary vine. It was not just a vine, but a connection to the heavens, a thread between our world and the one above, a link between the living and the divine. When the vine was severed, so was our connection to the heavens. The light was lost to us. The wind sighed through the trees, as though the earth itself mourned with them. The elder's gaze turned upward, his voice taking on a tone of reflection, almost as if he were speaking directly to the sky itself. But we did not forget. No, we carried on, and in time we found our way to the surface again. But the bond we once had with the earth was no more. It was severed, just like the vine. And so we learned that from darkness we must emerge into the light, but always with the knowledge that light too can be lost. The firelight flickered as the elder's tale ended, the last of the embers cracking and popping, their light dimming into darkness. The listeners remained silent, each one reflecting on the meaning of the story, what it might have meant to their ancestors, and what it might mean to them now. But the elder was not finished. He shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though preparing to weave another layer into the story, a detail that had always lingered just below the surface. Many years ago, he continued, his voice lowering with an almost conspiratorial air, the people of our tribe told of a world that was not always as it is now. They spoke of an island, a great island that once stood upon the water. It was a place of power, of mystery, and the people who inhabited it were not like the ones who came after. No, they were different. They were great, powerful people. The atmosphere around the fire seemed to thicken as the elder's words hinted at secrets long buried. There are legends, the elder said, his voice now almost a whisper, that speak of a time when our people, the Mandans, were not alone. We were once a great and mighty nation. But something happened. The land, the great island, sank into the sea. The world that we knew was lost. The fire flickered again, casting long shadows across the group. The stories of the Iowa tribe, a distant cousin of ours, tell of the time when all the tribes of the earth were one. They lived on an island that was beyond the great waters, somewhere to the east, toward the sunrise, and they crossed those waters, not knowing how long it took, nor whether the water was salt or fresh. But they crossed. The elder's eyes gleamed in the firelight, and a strange, knowing smile crossed his face. But the Mandans, as we know, were special. Our ancestors were not just wanderers. No, they were colonists. They came from somewhere else, a place beyond the sea, a place where the gods themselves had walked. The listeners murmured among themselves, the fire now burning more brightly, casting its golden glow upon the faces of the elders. The elder's voice grew stronger with each word, as if he were channeling the very spirit of his ancestors. And when the great disaster came, when the earth shook and the waters rose, there was one man who survived. A white man, as the legends say. He was the last, the only one. He saved himself in a boat. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the faint sound of a dove cooing in the distance, as though the very earth were acknowledging the tale. And when the waters receded, the elder whispered, the dove returned, carrying a branch of willow in its beak. It was a sign of hope, of renewal. And from the ashes of the old world, a new one arose. A chill swept through the circle as the story reached its conclusion. The Mandans, the survivors, had emerged from the depths, from the darkness, from a place that had once been their home, a place beyond the sea. And though the vine had broken and the light had been lost, they had found their way to the surface, to the earth above. And they had carried with them the story of the world before, the world of Atlantis, a world that lived on in their blood, in their myths, in the flicker of the firelight. The past, it seemed, was never truly gone. It was always waiting just beneath the surface. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying the scent of damp earth and the faint murmur of a distant river. The village of the Dakotas or Sioux was quiet as the evening settled in, the last slivers of the sun casting a golden glow on the earth. Beneath the endless stretch of sky, an elder sat near the fire, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering flames. His hands, calloused from years of toil, rested calmly in his lap. Around him, a small circle of young warriors and listeners gathered, their eyes fixed on the elder, their hearts ready to hear the stories of their ancestors, stories that connected them not just to their land but to a far greater, more mysterious past. The elder's voice broke the silence, low and rich, echoing through the stillness of the night. There was a time, he began, long before the world was as we know it today, when our people, the Dakotas, lived among the Mandans, the Iroquois, and the others. All our tribes, united as one, share stories of a great flood that came and swallowed the land. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he gazed into the fire. The embers danced like tiny spirits in the dark. It is said, he continued, that the waters rose higher and higher, swallowing everything in their path. The earth itself was drowned and all life with it. The great sea, the same that our ancestors spoke of, came upon the land, and there was no dry earth left. No man, no beast, no bird, only the waters. A chill settled over the group as the elder's words seemed to pull them into the depths of this ancient memory. One young warrior shifted uneasily, a frown creasing his brow. The Sioux say, the elder went on, his voice soft but steady, that the world was once without land. The waters were so vast that no one knew where the earth ended and the sea began. All mankind had disappeared, swallowed by the great flood. No one survived, save for a family and 2 animals of every kind. A murmur of disbelief passed through the group. One man, an elder himself, spoke up. "Is it true, old friend? Did the waters really come and drown us all?" The elder met his gaze, the flicker of firelight casting shadows across his features. "It is said that we are the survivors," he replied, "the ones who lived to tell the story. Our ancestors, through their strength and spirit, found a way to escape. Some say it was by the grace of the Great Spirit, others say it was by the will of the land itself." He sat back, his hands clasped together as though holding the weight of the past itself. "But it was not just the Sioux, no," he continued, his tone now heavy with the ancient weight of myth. "Other nations, Mandans, Iroquois, Chickasaws, they too have their stories of a time when the land was lost. The Iroquois speak of the sea rising, encroaching upon the land, destroying all human life. The Chickasaws say a great flood came and only one family was saved, along with 2 of every animal." A young man sitting near the front leaned forward, eager to understand. "But how did they survive? What did they do?" The elder looked up, his eyes reflecting the depth of the story. "The stories are clear," he said slowly. "In one version, the Okanagas, a people of great power, had their own flood tale. They speak of a god named Skiapi and another called Chacha. They were the ones who knew all, who could see the future. But their most powerful deity, a medicine woman named Skomalt, ruled over a land, an island perhaps, that was destroyed by war." The young man's brow furrowed as he tried to piece the puzzle together. "War? What war could have been so great?" The elder nodded. The noise of the battle was heard for miles. Skomalt, angered by the strife, rose in fury, using her power to drive the warring tribes to one end of the island. And then she did something that changed everything. She broke off the piece of land they stood on and sent it adrift upon the sea to float where it would. The circle of listeners sat in stunned silence, absorbing the enormity of this tale. The fire crackled and the air grew heavy with the weight of the elder's words. "Skomalt's island," the elder continued, "drifted upon the water, tossed by the winds until only 2 remained. A man and a woman, the last survivors, escaped in a canoe and found their way to the mainland. From them, the Okanagas were born." The elder leaned forward, the firelight dancing in his eyes. It was a time of rebirth. The flood had come, and from its depths, life returned. And from those survivors, a new people arose. The young warrior, eyes wide, whispered, "But what does it mean? What is the connection?" The elder's voice grew soft, filled with a mysterious reverence. "The stories are not just tales. They are the echoes of a time before time. The flood, whether it was of water or of fire, of earth or of sky, reminds us of the fragility of life. It is a reminder that all things can be lost, but from the ashes, from the waters, something new will always rise. As the night deepened and the fire crackled lower, the elder's voice took on a more somber tone. Even the Nicaraguans speak of a flood. They say that ages ago the world was destroyed by water. Most of humanity perished. But the gods, the Teotes, restored the earth to its former state, as it was in the beginning. The young men exchanged glances, their thoughts turning to the vast expanse of the world, to the unknown reaches beyond the horizon. The elder's voice rose again, carrying with it the ancient weight of all the stories that had come before. And the Apaches, he said, tell of a time when the world was peaceful, untouched by the chaos of men. But the flood came. Only Montezuma and the Coyotes survived, and Montezuma in his bitterness tried to build a tower to reach the heavens. But the Great Spirit in his wrath destroyed it with thunderbolts. A silence fell over the group, and the young warrior who had asked earlier now spoke again, his voice filled with wonder. It is the same then in every tale. The waters come, the world is destroyed, but from the destruction life is reborn. The elder nodded slowly. Yes, my son, and from that rebirth, the land, the people, and the spirits are changed. It is a story of destruction, yes, but also of renewal. The flood, the great deluge, is a symbol of what was lost and what was regained. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the ground. The elder's story had woven through the minds of the listeners, connecting them not just to the past, but to something greater. The flood, the water, the island, these were not just stories. They were the memory of a lost world, a world that lived on in the hearts of the people. And as the embers of the fire glowed dimly, the elder's words lingered in the night air. From the flood, from the darkness, from the waters, we rise again. And we remember.